Hey guys, tonight we are stepping somewhere most people only ever see in movies. Torchlit stone corridors, iron-banded doors, the distant sound of water dripping somewhere you cannot quite locate. Tonight, you are going to find out exactly why you would not last a single day inside a medieval dungeon. Not because you are weak, not because you lack courage, but because the dungeon was not simply a place to put people. It was a machine. A slow, deliberate sensory machine designed to take a human being apart, piece by piece, starting from the very first moment those iron doors swung shut behind you. You probably will not survive this, and honestly, most people who actually lived through it would agree with you. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you are listening from somewhere interesting tonight, drop your location and local time in the comments. There is something quietly wonderful about knowing that someone in Edinburgh and someone in Manila and someone in a small town in rural Ohio are all drifting off to the same story at the same moment. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The year does not matter as much as you might think. Could be 1150, could be 1320, it could be somewhere deep in the 1400s when dungeon keeping had become, if such a thing is possible, almost professionally refined. What matters is this: you have been taken. Maybe you said the wrong thing to the wrong lord. Maybe you owed a debt that ballooned beyond your ability to pay. Maybe you were simply in the wrong place when soldiers needed someone to blame for something. The exact reason is almost secondary now, because the moment the guards close their hands around your arms and march you forward, the reason stops being the story. The dungeon becomes the story. You are walking or being walked, which is a meaningfully different thing, through a castle's outer courtyard as evening settles in. The air still smells like wood smoke and damp straw and the distant, greasy warmth of cooking fires somewhere in the great hall above. These are the last genuinely pleasant smells you will experience for a very long time, and you do not know that yet, which is perhaps the only mercy on offer tonight. The entrance to the dungeon is not dramatic, by the way. There is no grand Gothic archway with a skull carved above it. No theatrical ravens perched on iron spikes. Well, usually not. Most dungeon entrances in medieval Europe were deeply, deliberately mundane. A low wooden door set into the base of a tower. A trapdoor in a floor sometimes barely wider than your shoulders. A narrow staircase that descends at such a steep angle that you have to turn sideways and feel your way down with your hands pressed against stone that is always cold. The plainness of it is part of the point. This is not a place that needs to announce itself. Your descent begins. Let's talk about what that actually feels like, because the physical reality of these spaces tends to get glossed over in popular imagination. Medieval dungeons, and historians use this term fairly loosely, covering everything from purpose-built underground cells to repurposed storage rooms in castle basements to the gap between a tower's outer and inner walls. A space known as an oubliette, a word that comes from the French oublier, meaning to forget, were almost universally built below ground level and often below the water table. This was intentional. Stone below ground stays cold and damp regardless of the season. In summer, when the world above you bakes and breathes and smells of hay and horses, you are in a pocket of perpetual winter. In actual winter, the moisture in the walls freezes into a fine frost that you will, within your first hour, already be scraping at with your fingernails simply because it is something to do. The darkness hits you before you reach the bottom step. Not the comfortable, familiar dark of a room with the curtains drawn, where your eyes slowly adjust and the furniture takes on soft shapes. This is a different category of darkness entirely. Medieval dungeon designers, if we are being generous and calling them designers, understood something that modern people rarely have occasion to learn firsthand. True darkness is not simply the absence of light. It is a presence. It sits on your eyes. It makes you blink reflexively over and over because your brain keeps insisting that surely there must be something to see, and it takes a genuinely unsettling amount of time before your nervous system accepts that no, there is nothing, and you should probably stop blinking now and start working on a more productive anxiety. The guards behind you have a torch. That torch is leaving. You understand this approximately 2 seconds before it actually happens, when the footsteps start retreating back up the stairs and the light begins to thin and the shadows on the walls stretch long and then longer and then simply consume everything. Then the door, or the trapdoor, or the iron grate, depending on your particular establishment of misfortune, closes. And here is where the sound changes in a way that most people find more unsettling than the darkness. Sound in underground stone spaces behaves strangely. Your own breathing comes back to you slightly too loud, slightly too close, as if someone is standing right beside you mimicking you. Your footstep, if you dare take one, produces a flat, muffled echo that doesn't bounce so much as it absorbs, swallowed immediately by the walls. And then beneath that, if you stand very still, you start to hear the other sounds. Water, yes, almost always water, either dripping from the ceiling where moisture seeps through the mortar, or running somewhere in a channel you cannot see and will probably step in before the night is through. And beneath even that, if your ears are sharp and your nerves are already fraying, which they will be, you may begin to hear breathing that is not yours. You are not alone, but we will get to your cellmates a little later. Right now, let us talk about what happens in the first few minutes, because this is the phase historians sometimes call the intake, though medieval jailers would not have used that word or perhaps any particular word at all. There was rarely paperwork. This is worth sitting with for a moment, because we live in an age where your existence generates documentation at every turn. Your name is logged, your description is noted, your crimes are officially recorded somewhere. In the medieval dungeon, especially the lower-grade variety operated by minor lords and small-town authorities rather than by royal institutions, you might simply be put in a cell with essentially no formal record that you were there. Historians still argue whether this was deliberate policy, a way of making people disappear cleanly, or simply the result of widespread administrative indifference. Either explanation is, in its own way, quite troubling. What did happen, in more formal settings, was a kind of physical processing that managed to be both brisk and deeply humiliating. Your outer garments were frequently taken. This served multiple purposes. It reduced your status immediately and visually. You went from being a person with clothes, which is a basic marker of social belonging, to being a person without them, which in a medieval context carried enormous psychological weight. It also, more practically, removed from you any tools, coins, or messages you might have been carrying. Guards were often allowed to keep whatever they found. This created an obvious incentive structure that did not always work in your favor, especially if the guard had a family to feed and you happened to be carrying something worth eating. Your shoes, if you had good ones, were also frequently taken. This is not a small thing. Stone floors at dungeon depth maintain a temperature that, in northern European climates, hovers somewhere that your bare feet will register as genuinely painful within about 20 minutes and genuinely dangerous within a few hours. The combination of cold stone, persistent moisture, and no footwear was one of the dungeon's more elegant passive cruelties. It required no active maintenance from the guards, cost nothing, and began its work the moment you sat down. You are sat down now, or you have found a wall to lean against, which amounts to the same thing. The wall is cold through your remaining clothes. The floor is cold through your remaining nothing. And here is where the first great psychological assault of the dungeon announces itself, not with drama, but with the most mundane weapon in existence: time. You have no idea what time it is. You came in during evening, you think, but you are not certain because the march through the castle courtyard took a while, and you were not exactly in a position to consult a sundial. You have no window, or if there is a window, it is a slit in the stone barely wide enough to admit a single finger, positioned near the ceiling, which you cannot reach, admitting no direct light, only a faint and entirely unhelpful variation in air temperature. You cannot hear the bells of the castle chapel reliably from down here. You cannot hear the roosters. You cannot see the sky. This is by design. The medieval dungeon's relationship with time was one of its most sophisticated features, and it operated without any of the elaborate gadgetry we associate with psychological manipulation today. It simply removed all the cues. Every human being, regardless of the era they live in, regulates their sense of time through external signals: light, sound, temperature shifts, the smell of meals being prepared. Strip those away and something genuinely strange begins to happen to your perception of duration. Hours feel like days. Days feel like weeks. The very concept of waiting begins to lose its shape because waiting implies an endpoint and you are no longer entirely sure there is one. A mainstream historical fact worth settling into here: archaeological excavations of dungeon spaces in castles across England, France, and the German states have repeatedly revealed scratch marks on the walls at roughly human height level. These are tally marks, mostly the universal, heartbreaking human instinct to count something, to make time visible, to impose a structure of days on a space that was built to erase them. Some of these marks run into the hundreds before they stop. Some stop after a handful. You do not think about why some stop so early. Or perhaps you do, and that is the problem. Here is a quirky and slightly strange footnote to all of this. Certain dungeons in medieval Europe were reportedly built with deliberate acoustic features. Not to enhance music, obviously, but to carry sound from the cell to a listening point elsewhere in the tower, allowing guards or lords to overhear conversations between prisoners without entering. The technology was simple, just carefully angled stone channels in the walls, but the effect was sophisticated. You might think you were whispering to your cellmate in perfect privacy, and somewhere above you, someone was hearing every word. Whether this was widespread practice or a particularly paranoid innovation of a few notable jailers is something historians still argue about with considerable enthusiasm at conferences. But that is a problem for later. Right now, in your first hour, you are doing something that almost every recorded account of medieval imprisonment mentions in some form. You are running your hands along the walls. Not searching for anything specific, not planning an escape, not even entirely conscious that you are doing it. You are simply making contact with the physical reality of your situation. The stone is rough, sometimes gritty with mineral deposits, sometimes slick with a thin film of moisture that you will very quickly stop noticing because novelty fades fast in the dark. There are gaps in the mortar in places. There are scratches. There are the marks of people who were here before you, and the fact that you cannot see them does not stop your fingers from finding them. Somewhere in the dark, something moves. Small, fast, gone before you can process it. You press your back harder against the wall and you breathe slowly, the way you breathe when you are trying to convince yourself that you are fine, which is a distinctly different rhythm from the breathing you do when you actually are fine. The iron door at the top of the stairs, or the trapdoor, or the iron grate is not coming back open tonight. You understand this in the way you understand things in the dark, not as a thought so much as a settling, a heaviness that distributes itself through your chest and shoulders and sits there. Welcome to the dungeon. You have been here for less than an hour and you have already lost your shoes, your outer garments, your sense of time, and your comfortable relationship with darkness. Tomorrow, if you can identify tomorrow, which, as we have discussed, is already becoming a slightly abstract concept, will be worse. But that is what we are here for. So let your breathing slow, let the story carry you, and let's keep going. The walls are not going anywhere, neither are you. So let us talk about them properly, because the stone surrounding you right now is not accidental. It is not simply the byproduct of building a castle and running out of ideas for what to do with the basement. The architecture of the medieval dungeon was, in its own grim and largely undocumented way, a considered piece of design work, and the more you understand about how these spaces were built, the more you appreciate, if appreciate is remotely the right word, and it isn't just how thoroughly they were engineered to defeat you. Let us start with location, because location is everything. The dungeon you are sitting in right now is almost certainly not at the bottom of a tall tower, despite what every castle illustration you have ever seen might suggest. The iconic image of the dungeon as a deep cylindrical pit beneath a soaring tower is partly accurate and partly a romantic embellishment that grew up around the reality rather than out of it. In truth, medieval imprisonment happened in a remarkable variety of spaces, and the choice of space said a great deal about your perceived importance and the intentions of the people holding you. If you were a high-value prisoner, a captured nobleman, a ransomable knight, someone whose continued breathing was worth money, you might find yourself in a tower room that was genuinely quite decent. Stone walls, yes. Locked door, yes. But also possibly a fireplace, a window with actual glass, or at least a wooden shutter, a rope bed, and occasional visitors. This was imprisonment as a financial transaction, and damaging the merchandise was bad business. Historians have documented cases of high-status prisoners in medieval England and France who spent years in comfortable tower confinement, receiving guests, corresponding by letter, and eating food that, while not lavish, was reliably nutritious. Being rich enough to be worth ransoming was, in the medieval world, a form of health insurance. You, however, are not a ransomable nobleman. If you were, you would not be where you are right now, which is at the opposite end of the architectural spectrum entirely. The lower dungeon, the space reserved for people whose suffering was either useful or simply unimportant, was almost always built to exploit the natural properties of its environment rather than to fight against them. Below-ground construction in medieval Europe was expensive and labor-intensive, which meant that purpose-built underground cells were mostly found in significant castles, royal fortresses, and major ecclesiastical buildings. Smaller operations made use of what they had. Storage cellars converted with an iron door and a lock, the gaps in rubble-filled walls, the base floors of towers where the stonework was thickest and the access most controllable. What all of these spaces shared, regardless of their origin, was a relationship with moisture that you are currently experiencing firsthand and will not soon forget. Medieval mortar was lime-based, porous, and permeable. Water moved through it constantly, especially in the lower levels of structures built on anything other than solid bedrock. The result was walls that were perpetually damp and cool weather, actively weeping in wet weather, and home to a soft, persistent bloom of moss and mold in the corners and along the floor joints that gave dungeon spaces their characteristic smell. A smell that people who have studied historical descriptions of these places consistently describe as a combination of cold mineral stone, standing water, organic decay, and something else, something harder to name, that is almost certainly the accumulated biological evidence of every person who has been kept here before you. The smell is important, not because it is unpleasant, though it is, but because of what it does over time. Your nose is an extraordinarily adaptable organ. Within roughly 30 minutes of exposure to a persistent odor, your olfactory receptors begin to habituate. The smell fades from your conscious awareness even as it continues to exist in full force around you. This is called olfactory fatigue, and under normal circumstances it is a useful feature. In a dungeon, it is a trap, because the moment the smell of the place stops registering as a distinct, alarming sensation, the place starts to feel, on some very low and treacherous level, normal. Your brain, desperate for stability and routine in an environment specifically designed to deny both, will grab onto any available signal of normality and build a small, fragile psychological shelter around it. The dungeon designers, again being generous with that word, did not need to understand neuroscience to exploit this. They simply built spaces that worked. The floor beneath you deserves its own paragraph because it is going to be your primary relationship for the foreseeable future. Medieval dungeon floors were rarely flagged in the way that castle interiors above ground were. In purpose-built cells, you might have rough-cut stone flags that were at least flat, though the gaps between them collected everything you can imagine and several things you would prefer not to. In converted spaces, the floor was often simply the earth, compacted soil, sometimes mixed with lime to reduce the worst of the biological activity, more often not. An earthen floor at dungeon depth absorbs moisture from below and collects it from above and maintains a consistency somewhere between firm and giving that is deeply unpleasant to sit on and even more unpleasant to sleep on. It is also, and you will discover this in due course, an active ecosystem. Let us talk about the ceiling briefly because it matters more than you might think. In a properly constructed dungeon cell, the ceiling was vaulted, a curved stone arch that was both structurally sound and acoustically useful in ways that served the jailer rather than the prisoner. A vaulted ceiling in a small stone room creates a particular quality of echo that takes the sounds of distress, weeping, shouting, the kind of involuntary vocalization that humans produce under sustained stress, and reflects them back into the space, amplifying rather than dissipating them. You might think this would work in a prisoner's favor, making their cries more audible to the outside world. In practice, the cells were deep enough and the walls thick enough that very little sound escaped upward. What the vault mostly accomplished was ensuring that you heard yourself very clearly, which in the specific context of prolonged distress is less reassuring than it sounds. The thickness of the walls is worth pausing on. Castle walls at ground level were typically between 2 and 4 meters thick, necessary for structural integrity and defensive strength. At lower levels, especially in tower bases and in specifically reinforced dungeon areas, that thickness could be considerably greater. You are sitting inside, essentially, a stone mass. The thermal mass of several meters of stone on all sides means that temperature changes in the outside world reach you slowly and partially. In practice, this means that the dungeon runs about 10 to 15 degrees cooler than outside air temperature in summer, which sounds pleasant until you factor in the moisture, and runs only marginally warmer than outside air in winter, which does not sound pleasant at all because it isn't. One of the more genuinely interesting architectural features of certain medieval dungeons, and here is your quirky tidbit for this stretch of the story, was the inclusion of what modern archaeologists have somewhat awkwardly termed sanitary channels. These were shallow grooves cut into the floor of the cell that sloped toward a central drain or a gap in the outer wall, designed to carry away the liquid waste produced by the cell's occupants. The interesting part is not that they existed, but that in a significant number of excavated dungeon spaces, these channels were found to run in the wrong direction, sloping slightly away from the drain rather than toward it, or positioned so that the drain was at the high end of the room rather than the low end. Historians still argue whether this represents simple miscalculation by the builders, deliberate malice on someone's part, or the inevitable result of settling and subsidence over time-shifting floors that were once level. Whatever the cause, the practical result for the occupants was the same. The door, let us come back to the door because it is the architectural element you are most immediately aware of. Medieval dungeon doors were engineering achievements of a specific and depressing kind. They were built not to be elegant or impressive, as the great doors of the castle's hall might be, but to be final. The wood was typically oak, seasoned and thick, often reinforced with iron bands that were hammered in place while the iron was hot and contracted as they cooled, tightening their grip on the wood rather than loosening it over time. The hinges were set into the stone itself, mortared in place, not simply bolted to the surface. The lock, in establishments that ran to locks, which was not all of them, was a heavy iron mechanism that required a specific key, and the key was kept, almost always, not by the guard immediately outside the door but by the head jailer or the Lord's Chamberlain, which meant that even if you managed to convince a sympathetic guard to help you, the logistics involved at least one additional person and therefore at least one additional point of failure. In less formal dungeons, the door was sometimes simply a wooden barrier held in place by external bars that dropped into iron brackets on either side. No lock, no key, no mechanism, just a bar that a child could lift from outside and that you had no access to whatsoever from inside. The simplicity of it was almost insulting. All the technological sophistication of the medieval world, and what kept you here was a piece of wood resting in two iron cradles. Some cells had no door in the conventional sense at all. The oubliette, and we mentioned this word earlier, that it means to forget, which should tell you everything, was a cell accessed only through an opening in its ceiling. You were lowered in or dropped in if your captors were feeling efficient, and the opening was then covered with a grate or a stone slab. To exit, you needed someone above to lift the cover and lower a rope or a ladder. If no one did that, you simply did not exit. The oubliette was not particularly common, and its reputation in popular history somewhat outstrips its actual prevalence. But the ones that existed were exactly as bad as they sound, and several notable ones have been excavated in French and Scottish castles with their original dimensions intact. They are, to put it gently, not large. The darkness in your cell right now is, if anything, getting more complete as your eyes fully abandon their search for something to latch onto. True dark adaptation, the process by which the rod cells in your retinas reach their maximum sensitivity, takes about 45 minutes. At the end of that process, in a normally dark space, you can usually see quite a lot: shapes, shadows, differences in gray. In a dungeon cell with no light source and no aperture admitting even moonlight, full dark adaptation simply reveals that there is nothing to see. Your visual system reaches the end of its adjustment process and presents you with the same complete blackness it started with, except now you know for certain that it is not going to improve. What this does to human psychology is well documented in modern research and was empirically understood, if not academically articulated, by medieval jailers through the straightforward mechanism of watching what happened to people. Human beings are profoundly visual creatures. We orient ourselves in space through vision. We regulate our emotional state partly through the visual cues around us. Familiar objects, the horizon, the faces of people we know. Remove all of that and the brain begins, slowly but persistently, to generate its own visual content. Not hallucinations in the dramatic sense, not immediately, but a kind of visual static, phosphenes, the firing of retinal cells without any external stimulus, producing faint geometric patterns and light impressions that are entirely internal and entirely unconvincing as substitutes for actual vision, but that your brain, in its desperation, keeps hopefully presenting to you anyway. There is a particular quality to the silence as well. You might think that silence is silence, that it is simply the absence of noise, but you have probably never been in a space this thoroughly insulated from the ambient sound of the world. The stone around you absorbs and blocks and deadens. The world above, the castle, the courtyard, the people going about their evening, the horses in the stable, the kitchen fires, the entire warm and indifferent machinery of medieval life, continues without you, and you cannot hear any of it. What you can hear, as the minutes pass, is a growing awareness of your own body as a sound-producing object. Your heartbeat, the liquid sounds of your digestive system going about its oblivious business. The sound of your own swallowing, which you will notice you are doing more often than usual because anxiety activates the salivary glands and the swallowing reflex in ways that your conscious mind has no vote over. The soft percussion of your own breathing. This is not comfortable. But here is the thing about discomfort in a sensory-deprived environment. It very quickly stops being remarkable. The mind does not sustain acute awareness of unpleasantness at the same intensity indefinitely. It habituates, finds a new baseline. The cold is now simply the temperature. The dark is now simply the condition. The smell is already gone, as we discussed. And what you are left with, after the acute phase of distress subsides into something duller and more persistent, is a state that medieval scholars occasionally wrote about in prisoners they visited. A kind of suspended animation of the spirit, a withdrawal into an interior space that was the only warm and lit room available. Historians still argue whether this psychological withdrawal was a form of resilience or the beginning of a more permanent unraveling. The answer, based on the accounts that survive, letters from imprisoned nobles, chronicles written by monks who visited dungeon populations, the occasional confession extracted under circumstances we will discuss in a later section, seems to be that it was both, simultaneously, and that which way it eventually tipped depended on factors as arbitrary as how long you were there, whether anyone on the outside was working to get you out, and whether your particular personality happened to include the specific and largely unchosen capacity for interior solitude that dungeon survival, it turns out, required above almost everything else. For now, though you are still an hour 2 or 3, you genuinely cannot say, and the cold is settling into your joints in a way that is transitioning from discomfort to something more insistent. You shift your position against the wall. The stone scrapes against your back through your remaining clothes. Something in the dark shifts in response to your movement, pauses, and then continues on its own small business. The architecture has done its work. You are oriented. Or rather, you are thoroughly disoriented, which was precisely the goal. The cell is not just a container. It is an argument made in stone that you are no longer the kind of thing that gets to have a window. Sleep, if it comes at all tonight, will come the way all bad things come in this place. Slowly, incompletely, and without asking your permission. Sometime in what you have decided to call morning, though you have no real evidence for this beyond a stubborn biological insistence that some amount of time has passed and surely someone somewhere is having breakfast, you hear footsteps on the stairs. Not the heavy, purposeful footsteps of someone coming to do something significant. Just footsteps. And then a sound that, in any other context, would be entirely unremarkable, the dull, ceramic knock of a bowl being set down on stone, followed by the scrape of something being pushed through a slot at the base of your door, followed by the footsteps retreating back up the stairs without a single word being exchanged. Breakfast has been served at the finest establishment in town. You find the bowl by feel, which takes longer than you would like and involves your hand encountering several things that are not the bowl before locating it. The bowl is rough-fired pottery, chipped at the rim, and it is warm, genuinely, unexpectedly warm, which produces a sensation so disproportionately comforting given the circumstances that you hold it in both hands for a long moment before you even think about what is inside it. Heat, it turns out, when you have been sitting on cold stone in complete darkness for several hours, registers somewhere between relief and revelation. What is inside the bowl is not going to sustain that feeling. Let us talk about what medieval prisoners ate, because this is one of those areas where the popular imagination has managed to be both too dramatic and not dramatic enough simultaneously. The popular image of dungeon food is a hunk of stale bread and a cup of water, shoved through a slot by a sneering guard. The reality was, well, it was not entirely wrong, but it missed several important nuances, all of which make the situation worse rather than better. The standard ration for a low-status prisoner in a medieval dungeon was built around two staples: bread and water, sometimes supplemented with pottage, which is the word medieval people used for what we might charitably call soup and what a modern health inspector would call a situation. Pottage was, at its most basic, water in which something had been boiled for a long time. That something could be almost anything: dried peas, old vegetables, grain, the less desirable parts of animals that the kitchen had no other use for, herbs if the cook was feeling generous, which was not a reliable condition. The result was a liquid that ranged, depending on the establishment and the season and the mood of whoever was preparing it, from thin and nearly flavorless to thick and nearly edible. What is in your bowl right now is toward the thin end of that spectrum. It is grayish. It is warm as established. It has things floating in it that you cannot identify by touch and have, in the absence of light, chosen not to investigate too closely. It smells of boiled grain and something else, something faintly fermented, that you decide not to think about. You eat it. Of course you eat it. You eat it because you are hungry and because the warmth is extraordinary and because the human body's appetite, it turns out, is significantly less principled than the human mind when those two things are in disagreement. The body says eat. You eat. The bread, when you find it, it was pushed through the slot separately, a flat, dense round that sits next to the bowl like a small geological formation, is stale in the specific way that medieval bread went stale, which is different from the way modern bread goes stale. Modern bread, made with refined flour and controlled yeast and often various preservatives, goes stale by losing moisture and becoming dry and crumbly. Medieval bread, made with coarsely ground grain that retained more of the bran and germ, went stale by becoming hard. Not crumbly, hard. The kind of hard that requires a deliberate decision and a functioning jaw and a willingness to commit. Soldiers on campaign learned to soften their bread rations in liquid before eating them, and you are about to independently arrive at this same technology by dunking your bread in the remaining pottage, which is either a stroke of practical genius or a fairly obvious response to the situation, depending on how you look at it. Here is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it is one that tends to genuinely surprise people. In medieval England, there was an actual legal standard for prisoner rations, at least in theory. It was called the diet of bread and water, and it was prescribed for prisoners awaiting trial or punishment who had not yet been convicted of anything, which is to say, it was considered the minimum standard for people who were still, technically, innocent. The bread was supposed to be a full loaf daily. The water was supposed to be clean. Whether these standards were actually met in practice was, as with most medieval regulatory frameworks, an entirely separate question from whether they existed on paper, and the answer to the practical question was, with impressive consistency, not really. Actual rations varied enormously depending on factors that had nothing to do with law or official policy and everything to do with the specific economic and social circumstances of your imprisonment. If someone on the outside, a family member, a guild, a religious institution, was paying for your upkeep, your rations could be supplemented with food sent from outside. This was a recognized practice and was even, in some jurisdictions, semi-formalized. You could pay the jailer a daily rate for improved conditions, better food, a candle, access to a slightly less awful space. This system was called, with magnificent medieval straightforwardness, easement, and it meant that the dungeon experience was, like most medieval experiences, profoundly shaped by your economic position. Rich prisoner, bad situation. Poor prisoner, significantly worse situation. This is not a dynamic that should surprise anyone, but it is worth naming. You have no one paying for your easement. This is already obvious from the quality of the pottage. The water situation deserves its own careful examination, because water in the medieval dungeon was not a simple thing, and its complications are going to affect you in ways that begin immediately and compound over time. The water you have been given, in a cup, also rough pottery, also pushed through the slot, comes from one of a small number of possible sources, none of which are ideal. Castle wells drew from underground water tables, and those water tables were not isolated systems. They were connected to the same soil that the castle's middens, its latrines, its kitchen waste channels, and its general accumulated biological activity had been sitting on for however long the castle had existed. Medieval people understood, in a practical if not germ-theoretical sense, that water from certain sources made you sick. They compensated, above ground, by drinking substantial amounts of ale and wine, which the fermentation process rendered considerably safer than untreated water. Ale especially, small ale, a low-alcohol version brewed specifically for daily consumption rather than for getting entertainingly intoxicated, was the standard daily beverage for most medieval people, including children, because it was safer than water and provided a modest caloric supplement. In the dungeon, you are getting water. Just water. There is no ale budget for prisoners, and even if there were, a drunk prisoner population would present obvious management challenges. So you drink the water because you must, and the water has been sitting in whatever vessel was used to transport it for an unknown amount of time, and the vessel has probably not been cleaned recently, and the source, as described, is not exactly a mountain spring. You drink it anyway because thirst overrides principle even faster than hunger does, and you try not to think too carefully about the faint aftertaste, which your mind is insisting on interpreting as mineral but which you are not entirely confident about. The caloric content of what you have just consumed is worth calculating, because your body is going to be doing this calculation automatically and the results are not encouraging. A standard pottage ration of the kind served to low-status prisoners provided perhaps 300 to 400 calories. The bread, depending on its size and density, might add another 200 to 300. Total caloric intake for a meal, somewhere between 500 and 700 calories, at generous estimate. If you are receiving 2 meals a day, which was the common standard morning and evening, you are looking at somewhere between 1,000 and 1,400 calories daily. A moderately active adult human requires somewhere between 2,000 and 2,500 calories per day to maintain their weight and bodily function. You are not receiving that. You are receiving roughly half of it. This is not sufficient. In the short term, the first few days, caloric restriction at this level produces hunger, irritability, difficulty concentrating, and a persistent mental preoccupation with food that medieval prisoners' accounts mention with remarkable consistency. You will find yourself thinking about specific foods in extraordinary detail. Not just food in general, but particular meals, particular smells, the memory of specific textures. This is your brain attempting to motivate you to do something about the caloric deficit, which is useful advice in a normal environment and completely useless advice in your current one. In the medium term, weeks to months, the deficit compounds. Your body begins consuming its own reserves. Muscle mass decreases before fat, especially under conditions of physical inactivity, which means that the muscular weakness you start to develop relatively quickly is not just a side effect of sitting still. It is your body cannibalizing its own structural tissue to keep your organs running. This process is gradual, and you would not feel it acutely on day 1 or day 10, but it was one of the mechanisms by which a long-term dungeon stay, even without any active torture or deliberate cruelty, produced permanent physical damage that former prisoners carried for the rest of their lives. Here is the quirky and slightly unsettling tidbit for this section. Medieval food historians have documented evidence that certain dungeon establishments, particularly those operated by monastic institutions, monasteries and abbeys that served simultaneously as places of religious life and, awkwardly, places of imprisonment for ecclesiastical offenders, maintained surprisingly detailed records of prisoner rations. These records survive in some archives and make for peculiar reading, because the monastic bureaucratic mind applied the same careful bookkeeping to dungeon food that it applied to everything else. Some of these records show ration allocations that were, at least on paper, quite specific. A precise number of ounces of bread, a measured volume of pottage, a designated quantity of ale on feast days. Other records from the same institutions show the actual expenditure on prisoner food, which is often dramatically lower than what the ration schedule would suggest was being spent. The gap between the scheduled ration and the actual expenditure tells its own quiet story, and historians still argue whether this discrepancy represents deliberate underprovision, administrative theft by the jailers pocketing the difference, or simply the natural entropy of institutional record-keeping in a world without auditors. Your second meal, when it comes, and you have been counting footsteps on the stairs, which has become your primary temporal measurement system because at least footsteps are a countable thing, is approximately the same as your first. More pottage, slightly cooler this time, as if it sat somewhere for a while before making its way to you. The bread is the same bread, or bread so similar as to be indistinguishable. The water is the same water, or water from the same source. What is not the same is your hunger. In the first meal you were hungry, yes, but hunger on the first day is a sharp and recent thing, a loud complaint from a body that still has reserves and knows it. By the second meal, having burned through some portion of your accessible energy stores and having had several hours to sit in the cold without any activity to distract from your body's running commentary on the situation, your hunger has deepened. It has stopped being sharp and become something more pervasive, a low background noise that is present in everything, that makes the pottage smell more significant than it is and makes you eat more slowly than you want to in an unconscious attempt to extend the experience of having food in front of you. You drink the water again, all of it, and then you sit with the empty cup for a while because it is warm from your hands and because it is something to hold. The issue of contaminated water and its consequences is one that we will return to when we discuss illness, because the effects are not immediate and the story of waterborne disease in medieval dungeon populations is one of those slow, invisible narratives that is somehow more affecting than the dramatic ones. For now, it is enough to know that your digestive system, which has been a dependable and largely taken for granted piece of biological infrastructure your entire life, is about to enter a period of sustained challenge that will make its presence known in ways that are both uncomfortable and, in the specific context of a cold stone cell with no functional sanitation, profoundly demoralizing. There is also the matter of salt. Human beings require dietary sodium to maintain basic physiological function, nerve transmission, fluid balance, muscle contraction. Medieval dungeon rations were almost entirely unsalted, partly because salt was expensive and partly because nobody was particularly concerned about the nutritional completeness of prisoner diets. The effects of sodium deficiency take longer to manifest than caloric deficiency, but they add to the cumulative physical degradation that the dungeon environment produces through a dozen different channels simultaneously. Historians studying the physical remains of long-term medieval prisoners, where such remains have been identified through archaeological and documentary evidence, have noted patterns of skeletal deterioration consistent with multiple concurrent nutritional deficiencies, which is the academic way of saying that the diet was doing several bad things to the body at the same time. The footsteps will not come again until what passes for evening. You know this not because you have been told, but because the two footstep events you have experienced seem to have been separated by approximately the same interval of interior time, and you are building a model of your days around this, because building models is what human minds do when they are deprived of external structure, and models are all that stand between you and the formless gray of complete temporal disorientation. You set the empty bowl down next to the wall where the slot is, because leaving it in the middle of the floor seems somehow wrong, seems like a kind of defeat that the bowl does not deserve, and because small acts of spatial organization are another thing that human minds do when they are trying to maintain the illusion of agency. You have a bowl. You have put the bowl somewhere specific. You have made a decision. These are not nothing, even if they are also, in the broader context, almost everything. Outside these walls, above you, beyond you, in a world that continues to exist in full color and sound and smell and warmth and the completely unremarkable miracle of people who know what time it is. Someone is probably eating something good right now. Bread that is not hard. Stew that has been properly seasoned. Perhaps ale, cool and yeasty and comforting in the way that ordinary pleasures are only fully appreciated in retrospect. You will think about that for quite a while. The bowl is empty. The cold is permanent. The dark is absolute. And somewhere in the wall to your left, something small and fast and utterly at home in this place is going about its evening, indifferent to your presence in the way that only creatures who have never had to think about dungeons can manage to be indifferent to dungeons. We should talk about that creature, and all its friends. The thing in the wall moves again. You have been tracking it by sound for what feels like 20 minutes, which means it has probably been about 7 because time continues to behave badly in here, and your internal clock, without any external reference points to anchor it, has started running at roughly 3 times its normal speed when you are anxious and approximately 1/10 of its normal speed when you are sitting still and trying not to think about anything, which is most of the time. The sound is a dry, papery scrabbling, the sound of small claws on stone, and it moves in a way that suggests something comfortable and familiar with the architecture, something that knows exactly where it is going and has made this particular journey many times before. You have a rat. Or rather, to be more precise about the property relations here, the rat has a dungeon, and you are a recent and not entirely welcome addition to its living space. This is an important distinction because the rat was here before you, knows this place better than you do, and will in all likelihood be here after you, a thought that you are going to try very hard not to follow to its logical conclusion. Medieval dungeons and rats had a relationship that was ancient, intimate, and entirely one-sided in terms of who was benefiting from the arrangement. Rats, specifically the black rat Ratus ratus, which was the dominant rodent species in medieval European structures before the larger and more aggressive brown rat began displacing it in the early modern period, were drawn to dungeon spaces for reasons that made complete practical sense from a rat's perspective. Below-ground stone spaces offered stable temperatures, protection from predators, plentiful nesting material in the form of straw bedding and discarded clothing, and the general organic debris that accumulated wherever humans were kept, and a reliable food source in the form of the dungeon's human population and whatever that population had been given to eat. The rats were not malicious. They were rational. They were, in their own way, better adapted to this environment than you were, and they knew it. And if rats are capable of anything resembling confidence, and anyone who has ever encountered a city rat at close range will tell you that they very much appear to be, then the rats of the medieval dungeon had it in abundance. Your first instinct, sitting in the dark and listening to the scrabbling get closer, is probably to make a noise, to stamp your foot or clap your hands and frighten it away. And this will work, for a value of work that means it will retreat to the wall and pause for approximately 90 seconds before resuming its approach, because dungeon rats were not particularly impressed by sudden noises. They had heard plenty of sudden noises. Sudden noises from prisoners were common and had never resulted in anything bad happening to any rat. The rat's threat assessment of you is accurate and unflattering. What the rat is interested in is not you specifically, not yet, but the bowl. The empty bowl that you placed by the wall, which still carries the residue of your pottage in its rough interior. The rat will find this bowl with a directness that suggests either an excellent sense of smell or a very good memory of where the food slot is located, and it will clean the bowl with a thoroughness that would be impressive in a less alarming context, and then it will sit for a moment, and then it will leave and you will hear it go, and then the dungeon will be quiet again and you will be alone with the knowledge that you now share your space with at least one rat and probably several more, because rats are social animals and where there is one there is a community. Here is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it carries more weight than it might initially seem to. The black rat was the primary vector for the fleas that carried Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for bubonic plague. The plague that devastated Europe beginning in 1347 and killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire continental population in its first wave moved along routes of rat and human contact. And enclosed spaces with high rat populations and compromised human immune systems, which is a precise description of a medieval dungeon, were environments where this transmission could occur with terrible efficiency. A prisoner in a dungeon during a plague year was not simply in a dungeon. They were in a dungeon during a plague year, which was a compounding of misfortunes so severe that even the medieval chroniclers, who were not generally given to understatement about suffering, tended to describe it in terms that suggested words were insufficient to the task. You are not necessarily in a plague year. But the rats are still here, and the fleas are definitely here, and we should talk about the fleas now because they are going to be more immediately relevant to your daily experience than the rats, which at least have the decency to be intermittently visible, or would be visible if there were any light, and to make sounds you can track. Fleas are not trackable. Fleas are simply a condition of existence in your current environment, like the cold and the dark and the smell, except that unlike those things, fleas are actively doing something to you. The human flea, Pulex irritans, and the rat flea, Xenophila chiopes, were universal presences in medieval dungeon environments, and their effect on prisoners was cumulative and compounding in ways that went well beyond simple discomfort. Flea bites produce itching through an allergic reaction to the flea's saliva, and itching in an environment where you cannot wash, cannot change your clothes, and cannot escape the source of the irritation does something psychologically that is difficult to convey to someone who has not experienced it. In the first day, flea bites are annoying. In the first week, with dozens of bites accumulating and each existing bite cycling through its natural inflammation process while new ones are added, the itching becomes a sustained, low-grade torment that interferes with sleep, with concentration, and with the already fragile psychological equilibrium that you are trying to maintain. In the first month, scratching at flea bites with dirty fingernails in an environment full of bacteria produces open sores that become infected, which produces a new category of physical problem that we will explore in more detail when we reach the section on illness. The lice deserve their own moment because they are doing something slightly different. Body lice, Pediculus humanus, live in clothing rather than on skin, which means that the removal of your outer garments at intake, while it was humiliating and cold, may have temporarily reduced your louse burden. However, if the remaining clothes you are wearing have been in this environment for more than a day or two, or if the straw or other material on the floor carries louse eggs from previous occupants, which it almost certainly does because louse eggs are extraordinarily resilient and can remain viable for weeks in fabric and organic material, then you are already being recolonized. And within a week you will have a thriving population distributed through the seams of your clothing in the warm spots closest to your body. Body lice feed by piercing the skin and drawing blood, which produces its own irritation distinct from flea bites, and more importantly, body lice are the vector for typhus, which is Rickettsia prowazekii, a bacterial infection that was one of the great killers in confined historical populations and that we will address properly later. You are scratching. You probably started scratching sometime in the last paragraph and have not noticed until now. It is fine. Scratching is rational. Let us now address the other occupants of your cell because the rats and fleas and lice are not the complete picture, and the complete picture includes fellow human beings, which sounds like it should be a comfort and is occasionally that but is more reliably a complicated mixed experience that the dungeon environment makes significantly more complicated. Medieval dungeons were rarely single-occupancy arrangements, at least not in the lower-grade facilities where the majority of prisoners were kept. Purpose-built high-security cells for specific high-value prisoners might house one individual, but the common dungeon population was grouped, sometimes loosely by offense or status but more often simply by available space, which meant that you might share your particular stone room with anywhere from 2 or 3 fellow prisoners to a dozen or more, depending on the size of the cell and how crowded the establishment currently was. Crowding fluctuated seasonally, post-harvest periods, when disputes over grain and land and debt became acute, tended to produce spikes in dungeon population, and periodically, after military engagements, after civil disturbances, after the kind of local political events that resulted in a lord needing somewhere to put a collection of enemies simultaneously. Your cellmates, if you have them, represent both a resource and a challenge, and the balance between those two things shifts constantly in ways that are hard to predict and harder to manage. On the resource side, another warm body in a cold stone space is a source of heat that is genuinely significant in the thermoregulatory calculus of dungeon survival. Medieval prisoners are documented in numerous sources as sleeping in physical contact with one another, not primarily for companionship, though that was a factor, but because shared body heat was the difference between a night that was cold and a night that was dangerously cold. There is nothing romantic about this. It is thermal arithmetic. 2 people sleeping pressed together conserve roughly twice the heat of 2 people sleeping separately, which is not a precise figure but captures the general principle accurately enough to explain why the practice was universal. On the challenge side, your cellmates are people under extreme stress, which means they are not necessarily at their best. Prolonged stress, caloric restriction, sleep deprivation, and the specific psychological effects of confinement that we will explore at length in a later section produce behavioral changes in human beings that tend toward irritability, suspicion, social withdrawal, and occasional aggression. The person who in normal life is patient and cooperative may, after 2 weeks in a dungeon, have become someone who guards their food ration with a vigilance that borders on violence and who interprets any accidental physical contact during sleep as a threat requiring immediate response. This is not a character flaw. It is a predictable neurological response to sustained adversity, but it is also very difficult to live alongside. Social hierarchies formed in dungeon populations, as they form in all confined human groups. These hierarchies were sometimes an extension of the social hierarchies that existed outside. A prisoner of higher social standing often maintained a degree of deference from lower status cellmates, and this could translate into practical advantages like a better sleeping position, first access to rations, and protection from the more volatile members of the group. But dungeon hierarchies could also invert normal social order in interesting ways. A prisoner who had been incarcerated longer than others carried a form of authority simply through experience. They knew the rhythms of the place, the names and habits of the guards, which positions in the cell were warmest, which times of day the rats were most active. This experiential knowledge was valuable and was often traded explicitly or implicitly for various considerations. Here is the quirky tidbit for this section, and it is one that I find genuinely touching in a melancholy way, archaeologists and historians studying graffiti in medieval prison spaces, and there is a substantial body of such graffiti, preserved in stone surfaces in castles and towers across Europe, have identified inscriptions that appear to be collaborative. Not one person's marks, but 2 or 3 people's hands working on the same image or text, a shared creative project in a space designed to deny all shared projects. At the Tower of London, at Chillon Castle in Switzerland, at locks in the Loire Valley, in the Bastille before its demolition, the walls retained evidence of people who had, in the absence of anything else to do, made things together. Drawings, calendars, religious imagery, names arranged in patterns that suggest deliberate composition rather than random scratching. Historians still argue whether these collaborative inscriptions represent genuine psychological solidarity between prisoners or simply the practical result of one person having superior artistic skill and others contributing what they could. But the distinction may be less important than the fact of the collaboration itself, which happened, which was real, which left marks in stone that survived centuries of indifference. The relationship between prisoners and their rat population was also more nuanced than the simple adversarial framing might suggest. Accounts from long-term imprisonment across the medieval period, including the famous account attributed to a prisoner at Chillon, which inspired Byron's poem several centuries later, though the historical details are somewhat layered with legend, describe the development of something resembling familiarity with the animal inhabitants of the cell. Not affection necessarily or not always, but a kind of recognition. This rat comes at this time, goes to this corner, responds to this sound. Tracking the rat's behavior became another form of timekeeping, another way of imposing structure on the structureless. It was also, occasionally, a food source. The records are sparse on this point for obvious reasons of palatability, but the logic is straightforward. A prisoner with access to a sufficient quantity of rats and the willingness to act on that access had a protein source that the dungeon administration had not budgeted for, and desperation, in a sufficient quantity, tends to resolve questions of willingness with some efficiency. The sounds of your cell at what you are going to call nighttime, because something in the pattern of footsteps on the stairs and the quality of the silence suggests that the castle above you has gone to its sleep, and you are using every available signal to reconstruct a timeline, are a layered thing. The rats are more active now, emboldened by the reduction in movement and noise from the world above. You can hear their commerce in the walls and along the floor, the occasional squeak that is either communication or conflict, the persistent background scratch of claws on stone. If there are other prisoners in your cell, you can hear their breathing, the involuntary sounds of people trying to sleep and mostly failing, the occasional shift and settle of a body on cold stone trying to find a configuration that is less uncomfortable than the last one. And beneath all of this, the dripping water, which has not paused for a moment since you arrived and shows no sign of pausing ever, a metronome for the dungeon that measures time in drops rather than in seconds, and that you have decided, in the absence of better options, is actually quite a soothing sound if you approach it with the right mental attitude, which takes considerable effort to sustain but is available to you if you work at it. Somewhere in what you are choosing to call the middle of the night, because even a fictional middle of the night is better than no temporal framework at all, you feel something land on your ankle. Something light. Something that sits for a moment and then moves with the purposeful, unhurried confidence of a creature that has never been seriously threatened by a human being. You hold very still. You have learned, in a very short time, that holding very still is the appropriate response to most things in here. The thing on your ankle, the rat, because of course it is the rat, they have determined that you are not a threat and have updated their behavior accordingly. Sits for 3 or 4 seconds that feel considerably longer, and then it moves on, following whatever route its small and efficient brain has planned for this particular traverse of the cell. You breathe out, outside the walls, in a world that contains seasons and meals and the faces of people you love and the completely miraculous ordinariness of knowing what day it is. None of this is happening. In here, you have just had a moment that you will remember with extraordinary clarity for the rest of your life. A moment in which a rat sat on your ankle in complete darkness and you held still and let it, because the dungeon has already taught you, in the space of what might be 1 day or might be 2, that you do not get to choose which things share your space. You only get to choose how you respond to them. You choose stillness. The rat moves on. The dripping continues. And somewhere in the walls, the colony goes about its night, warm and purposeful and entirely at home in a place that was built to make you feel the opposite of all of those things. The footsteps that matter are not the food footsteps. You have learned to distinguish them already, which is either a sign of impressive adaptability or a sign of how thoroughly your sensory priorities have been reorganized by this environment, and the answer is probably both. The food footsteps are a single set, unhurried, descending at the same pace every time, pausing at the slot, retreating. They have a domestic quality, a routine quality, the sound of someone doing a task they have done so many times it no longer requires thought. These footsteps you have come to regard with something that is uncomfortably close to affection, because they mean warmth, and because warmth, in here, is the closest thing to love that the architecture permits. The footsteps that matter are different. They are multiple. They descend with a weight and deliberateness that is distinct from the food delivery shuffle, a rhythm that says several people are coming and they are not carrying bowls. They carry the sound of keys, not the light jingle of a housekeeper's ring, but the heavier, more purposeful clank of large iron keys being moved with intention rather than habit. And there is a torch. You know there is a torch before the door opens, because light, when it finally arrives in your cell after however many hours of complete darkness, does not simply appear. It announces itself. It seeps under the door gap first, a thin gold line that is so startling in its brightness that your dark-adapted eyes register it as almost painful. And in those few seconds between the light's arrival and the door's opening, you experience something that is equal parts relief and dread in a combination that your emotional vocabulary does not have a clean word for. The door opens. This is a warden's visit, and we need to talk about what that means, who is standing in that doorway, and what the power dynamics of the medieval dungeon looked like from the inside, because the relationship between prisoner and jailer in the medieval period was one of the most complex, most contingent, and most consequential relationships a person could find themselves in. And understanding it properly requires setting aside several assumptions that modern people bring to the concept of institutional imprisonment and replacing them with something considerably stranger and more human. The person most likely standing in your doorway is not a guard in any modern sense of the word. The medieval dungeon staff was not a professional corps of trained correctional officers operating within a defined institutional framework. It was, more typically, a collection of individuals whose presence in the dungeon was the result of a variety of overlapping circumstances, some chosen and some not, and whose relationship to their work ranged from professional indifference to something darker at one end and something surprisingly humane at the other, with the distribution between these possibilities varying enormously depending on the specific establishment, the specific lord's preferences, and the specific economic conditions of the moment. At the top of the dungeon hierarchy was the keeper, sometimes called the constable in larger royal establishments, sometimes simply the jailer, a title that carried in medieval usage a legal specificity that the modern term somewhat obscures. The keeper of a dungeon was, in a genuine legal sense, personally responsible for the prisoners in their custody. If a prisoner escaped, the keeper could face serious penalties, including imprisonment themselves in some jurisdictions, which created a professional incentive structure that expressed itself in a very particular kind of thoroughness. The keeper did not want you to escape. Not because they necessarily bore you any personal animosity, though some did, but because your escape was their disaster. This meant that the keeper's relationship to security was intimate and anxious in a way that went beyond simple job performance, and this anxiety expressed itself in the physical environment, in the thickness of doors, in the frequency of checks, in the specific arrangements of locks and bars, and also in the social environment of the dungeon, in the patterns of interaction between staff and prisoners that were shaped at every level by this fundamental asymmetry of consequences. Beneath the keeper was a variable number of subordinate jailers and turnkeys whose responsibilities included food delivery, the maintenance of the physical space, the management of prisoner interactions, and the execution of whatever the keeper or the lord above the keeper required. These individuals were typically poorly paid, socially marginal, and possessed of the specific kind of authority that comes from having official power over people who have no recourse, a combination that historically tends to produce a wide range of human behavior, from the genuinely compassionate to the genuinely terrible, with the distribution again highly dependent on individual character and institutional culture. Pay for dungeon staff in medieval England and France was frequently below what comparable positions in other parts of the castle economy received, a disparity that had significant practical consequences. An underpaid jailer was a jailer with economic incentives operating outside the official relationship, And the medieval dungeon economy was built on this foundation with a frankness that the period's other institutions sometimes obscured behind more elaborate fictions. Bribery was not simply possible in the medieval dungeon. It was the expected and semi-formalized mechanism by which various aspects of the prisoner experience were negotiated. You wanted a candle? You paid for a candle either in coin or in whatever else you had to offer: information, a letter written on behalf of someone, a promise of future payment contingent on your eventual release. You wanted the rats managed? You paid for that too. You wanted to know what was being said about your case in the courts above? You paid for information, and the information you received was probably partially accurate and partially shaped by what the jailer thought you wanted to hear and were therefore most likely to pay for. This economy was so established that it appears in contemporary legal documents not as corruption but simply as how things worked. Some jurisdictions attempted to regulate it by setting official fee schedules for various prisoner services, which had the effect of formalizing the bribery rather than eliminating it, and which, at least in theory, put a ceiling on what could be charged for specific items. Whether the ceiling was respected in practice was, once again, a separate question. Historians still argue whether the medieval dungeon's informal economy represented a pragmatic adaptation to institutional underfunding or a systemic corruption that made the already terrible experience of imprisonment into something actively predatory. And the answer is almost certainly yes to both simultaneously, in proportions that varied by location and period. The person standing in your doorway right now is carrying a torch, which means the light is extraordinary and your eyes are watering and you are squinting in a way that makes you look either pathetic or defiant, depending on how you frame it. Behind them are one or two others, staying back slightly, which suggests this is a routine inspection rather than something more purposeful, and the distinction between those two things is one you have already developed a keen interest in. A routine inspection means someone is checking that you are alive and have not escaped and have not done anything notable with the walls, all of which you can confirm without difficulty. Something more purposeful means something more purposeful, and we will get to what that looks like in the next section because it deserves its own careful treatment. The keeper or the turnkey or whoever the specific person is looks at you with an expression that is very difficult to read in the flickering torchlight, but that contains, as best you can determine, approximately zero personal interest in you as an individual. This is both reassuring and destabilizing, because being of no personal interest to the person controlling your access to food, warmth, and light is simultaneously the safest possible relationship and a reminder that your existence in this place is entirely instrumental, that you matter only insofar as you remain in the cell and alive and non-escaped, and that beyond those minimum requirements you are not a particularly interesting feature of the keeper's professional landscape. They say something. In whatever language the dungeon operates in, Latin if this is an ecclesiastical establishment, a regional vernacular if it is secular, possibly neither if the keeper is not inclined toward conversation, which many were not, they say something that is either a question or an observation or simply a noise that fills the silence without requiring a response. You respond. What you say matters less than how you say it, and what you are trying to communicate with every vocal and physical signal available to you is that you are cooperative, that you are not a problem, that you represent no particular threat to the keeper's professional security, and therefore no particular reason for the keeper to make your situation worse than it currently is. This is not cowardice. This is the accurate assessment of your negotiating position, which is approximately nothing, adjusted for the reality that nothing can still be expressed more or less graciously, and graciousness has historically been the low-cost, high-value investment of dungeon survival. The light is extraordinary. You had forgotten, in however many hours of darkness have passed, the specific quality of torchlight on stone, the way it makes the walls warm and alive-looking, the way shadows move with the flame and give the space a kind of flickering depth that the darkness denies entirely. It is making the dungeon almost beautiful, which is a thought that you immediately recognize as a sign of how thoroughly your aesthetic standards have been recalibrated, and then you recognize the recognition as evidence that some part of your analytical mind is still functioning, which is actually reassuring, and then the torch moves and the shadows shift and you watch all of this with an attention that would embarrass you in any other context. The inspector, let us call them that for simplicity, moves around the cell in the systematic way of someone following a routine they have performed many times. They check the walls where the walls are checkable, which in a well-maintained dungeon means looking for any evidence of digging or weakening, the kind of patient, incremental work that prisoners with sufficient time and motivation occasionally attempted. They check the floor for similar reasons. They look at you with that professionally incurious gaze. They note whatever they note, which may be recorded somewhere or may simply be retained in the keeper's memory, depending on the administrative culture of the establishment. And then they do something that varies more than any other aspect of this interaction, something that in its variation tells you more about the specific human being behind the institutional role than any other single gesture. They either turn and leave or they pause. The pause is the thing. The pause is where the human being inside the keeper decides what kind of keeper they are going to be in this specific moment with this specific prisoner. Some pauses end with a question about your well-being that is routine but is still, technically, a question about your well-being, which means someone asked. Some pauses end with a small act of unofficial generosity. A piece of bread that is not part of your official ration. A moment of torchlight left burning slightly longer than necessary. A word of information about what is happening with your case in the courts above that costs the keeper nothing to share but is worth everything to you. Some pauses end with something else entirely. Something less generous and more interested in demonstrating the specific pleasures of unchecked authority in a space where no one above is watching and no one below has any recourse. Here is the mainstream historical fact for this section, and it is one that contextualizes the keeper relationship with uncomfortable precision. In medieval England, the system of imprisonment was not primarily funded by the crown or the relevant lord in the way that modern incarceration is funded by the state. Instead, the keeper was expected to generate the revenue to run the dungeon partly from the prisoners themselves, through the fee system described above, and partly from contracts with families and institutions paying for prisoner upkeep. This meant that a keeper who was running a dungeon full of poor prisoners with no outside support was running, in a meaningful economic sense, a failing business, and the ways in which this financial pressure expressed itself in the treatment of the prisoner population were not uniformly benign. Some keepers responded to economic pressure by reducing rations below the already minimal standard, pocketing the difference, as discussed. Some responded by renting out prisoner labor to local businesses or farms, a practice that existed in a legal gray area, but was widespread enough to appear regularly in court documents when disputes arose. Some responded by making the dungeon's informal economy more aggressive, raising the prices for basic amenities to the point where prisoners with outside resources were essentially paying for their own humane treatment and prisoners without were experiencing the default, which was not humane. The quirky and slightly remarkable tidbit here involves a specific medieval English keeper whose records survive in unusual detail. The keeper of the Fleet prison in London in the early 14th century maintained what amounts to a price list, inscribed on a document that still exists in archival form, that itemized the cost of various prisoner services with a specificity that is almost impressive in its thoroughness. Better rooms were priced by the week on a sliding scale based on their distance from the worst parts of the building. Access to the prison's internal tavern, which yes, the Fleet prison had a tavern, was priced separately. The right to walk in the prison yard for a specified period each day was priced. The right to have visitors was priced. The document reads, to modern eyes, less like a prison administrative record and more like the menu of a particularly grim hotel, and historians still argue whether the Fleet's elaborate fee structure was representative of medieval imprisonment generally or whether the Fleet, as a primarily debtor's prison in a major commercial city, occupied a specific economic niche that makes direct comparison to dungeon conditions elsewhere misleading. You do not have access to the Fleet's yard-walking privileges. You are in a different kind of establishment entirely, and the keeper standing in your doorway has completed their pause and made their decision, which in this case is the leaving decision, the turn and go up the stairs decision. And as they go, the torch goes with them and the light withdraws in the same slow, painful way it arrived, the gold line under the door thinning and then disappearing, and the darkness returns, and the cold returns, and your eyes, having been forced through a rapid cycle of dilation and constriction by the torch's presence and absence, now need to go through the full adaptation process again, which is going to take another 45 minutes and is going to feel exactly as disorienting as the first time. But here is what the visit has given you, apart from the experience of light and the confirmation that you are still on someone's list of things to check. Information. Small, fragmentary, partial information of the kind that the dungeon doles out in minimum viable doses, but information nonetheless. You heard voices at the top of the stairs before the descent. You heard, or thought you heard, something about a date, a name, a reference to something external that your mind has been turning over since the door closed, trying to extract meaning from a fragment that may have been misheard entirely. You do not know if the information is accurate. You do not know if the keeper intended you to hear it or if it was accidental. You do not know with any confidence what it means for your situation, but you have something to think about now which is not nothing. In a space designed to give you nothing, a fragment of possibly meaningful, possibly accurate information is a currency of considerable value, and you will spend it carefully, examining it from different angles in the dark, building and rebuilding small theories around it the way a person builds a fire from inadequate materials, not because the fire is guaranteed to light, but because the building is something to do with your hands while the cold and the dark and the rats and the dripping water continue their patient, impersonal work around you. The keys clank up the stairs. The door at the top closes. The dungeon settles back into its baseline condition, which is all of the things it always is, unchanged by the visit, unremarked upon, eternal in the specific way that stone spaces become eternal when they have been doing the same thing for long enough. You pull your knees to your chest, which is warmer than having them extended, a discovery you made sometime in the first night and have been applying consistently since. The rats resume their commerce. The water drips its patient arithmetic. And somewhere in the stone above you, the world that contains keepers and torches and fee schedules and price lists and taverns inside prisons and every other texture of the complicated human machinery that runs this place continues to operate, indifferent to what it contains, which at this particular moment includes you. The visit is over. The next one will come when it comes. Until then, you have the dark and the cold and the fragment of information and the rats, and you are learning, with a speed that would surprise you if you had the perspective to observe it, how to make something livable out of that inventory. Whether livable and survivable are the same thing remains, at this stage, an open question. There is a room above you. Not directly above, several floors above, and along a corridor that you have never seen but that you have constructed in your mind with considerable detail over the past however many days, has been built from the sounds that travel down through the stone when the castle is quiet enough for sound to travel. It is a room with a specific purpose, and the people who work in it have a specific vocabulary, and the equipment it contains was designed, with medieval ingenuity applied to a very particular problem, to make the human body say things that the human mind had decided not to say voluntarily. You have been thinking about this room since approximately your second day in the dungeon, not obsessively, not in the way that produces panic, but in the background, the way you think about weather when you are planning something that depends on the weather, with a watchful, calculating attention that has not yet resolved into certainty in either direction. This is the section where we talk about torture, and I want to do that carefully, because the subject sits at the intersection of historical reality, popular mythology, and genuine human suffering in ways that require some precision to navigate well. The medieval torture chamber of popular imagination. A vast, shadowy room filled with every ingenious device ever illustrated in a 19th century history book, staffed by hooded figures and operating continuously on a rotating population of screaming prisoners, is a significant exaggeration of a reality that was, in its actual form, both more bureaucratic and more terrible than the theatrical version, and understanding the difference matters. Let us start with the legal framework, because torture in the medieval period was not simply something that happened to people in dungeons as a matter of course. It was, in the jurisdictions that permitted it at all, a legally defined procedure with specified conditions, official authorization requirements, and at least nominal procedural constraints. This sounds almost reassuring until you examine what those constraints actually were, at which point the reassurance evaporates completely, but the legal framework is still worth understanding because it shaped who got tortured, when, and how, in ways that were meaningfully different from simple arbitrary cruelty. Roman law, which formed the backbone of legal procedure across much of continental Europe through the medieval period, permitted judicial torture under a specific set of circumstances. Torture was authorized as a means of obtaining confession in cases where a serious crime was alleged, typically crimes punishable by death or mutilation, where there was already significant circumstantial evidence of guilt, but where that evidence fell short of the standard required for conviction, which in Roman-derived systems required either 2 eyewitnesses or a confession. The confession requirement was the engine that drove the torture machine. If you needed a confession to convict, and the accused was not providing one voluntarily, and the evidence strongly suggested guilt, The legal system had constructed an authorized pathway to compelled confession that was simultaneously logically coherent within its own framework and catastrophically prone to producing false confessions from innocent people who simply wanted the pain to stop. In England, the situation was different and worth noting explicitly as your mainstream historical fact for this section: English common law, which diverged significantly from Roman law in its evidentiary requirements and procedural assumptions, did not formally incorporate judicial torture as a legal procedure. This meant that torture in England required royal warrant, a specific written authorization from the Crown, and was officially restricted to cases involving treason or serious threats to state security. In practice, royal warrants for torture were issued with some regularity in periods of political instability, and the Tower of London's records document numerous cases where torture was applied under warrant in ways that stretched the official restrictions considerably. But the formal absence of torture from English common law procedure meant that the English dungeon population experienced it less routinely than their continental counterparts, which is a very narrow form of comparative good fortune but is still, technically, a form of it. On the continent, in France, in the German states, in Italy, in Spain, judicial torture was woven into legal procedure in a way that made it a standard tool of criminal investigation rather than an exceptional measure. The French system, which was among the most elaborated, distinguished between preliminary torture, applied to extract information about accomplices and circumstances before conviction, and punitive torture, applied after conviction as part of the sentence itself. These were legally distinct procedures with different authorization requirements and different official time limits, though the practical differences were somewhat academic from the perspective of the person being tortured. Now let us talk about what was actually used, because this is where the popular imagination requires the most significant correction, in both directions. On one hand, the medieval torture toolkit was genuinely extensive and genuinely terrible. On the other hand, many of the most spectacular devices that appear in popular histories of medieval torture, the Iron Maiden, the elaborate spiked chair, the breast ripper, the pear of anguish, are either later inventions, significant elaborations of simpler originals, or in some cases complete fabrications that entered the historical record through the enthusiastic confabulation of 19th-century antiquarians who were building museum collections and found that dramatic instruments attracted more visitors than documentation of the mundane realities of rope and cold water. The actual tools of medieval judicial torture were, for the most part, technically simple and physiologically sophisticated in a way that required no elaborate manufacturing. The strapado was among the most widely used on the continent. The prisoners' hands were bound behind their back, and they were hoisted into the air by a rope attached to their wrists, a position that placed the full weight of the body on the shoulder joints in a direction they were not designed to bear, producing excruciating pain without necessarily causing the kind of obvious visible damage that would raise questions about the prisoner's fitness to appear in court. The strapado could be applied in degrees: a simple suspension, a suspension with added weights attached to the feet, or a drop version where the prisoner was raised and then allowed to fall almost to the ground before being jerked to a stop, a variation that was likely to dislocate the shoulders, and that was applied when the simpler version had not produced the desired result. The rack, which is probably the torture instrument most people would name if asked, was real and was used, though considerably less universally than its reputation suggests. It was expensive to build and maintain, required a dedicated space, and was most associated with well-funded royal and state establishments. The Tower of London had one, and it was used, with documented royal authorization, in a number of notable cases during the Tudor period, which is slightly outside our medieval window but continuous with the medieval tradition. The rack worked by stretching the body horizontally, with the wrists and ankles attached to rollers turned in opposite directions, placing the joints of the spine, hips, shoulders, and knees under progressive tractile stress. The damage it produced was real, lasting, and in severe applications permanent. Water torture. Forcing a prisoner to ingest large quantities of water or, in one variant, placing a cloth over the prisoner's face and pouring water over it to produce the sensation of drowning, was documented across multiple jurisdictions and required no equipment beyond water and a cloth, which made it available to establishments that could not afford more elaborate apparatus. Its simplicity made it among the most widespread of the documented methods, and its psychological effects, the particular terror of controlled suffocation, which activates survival responses that are among the most primitive and powerful in the human neurological toolkit, made it among the most effective at producing confessions regardless of their truthfulness. Here is the quirky and historically contested tidbit for this section: the question of whether medieval torture actually worked, in the sense of producing accurate information rather than simply producing confessions, was debated by medieval legal scholars themselves, with a sophistication that is sometimes surprising to modern readers who assume the period had no critical perspective on its own practices. Jurists, including the 13th-century Italian legal scholar Alberto Gondino, explicitly acknowledged that torture produced unreliable testimony, that people would say anything to stop pain, and that confessions obtained under torture required independent corroboration to be considered trustworthy. The legal systems that employed torture typically incorporated this acknowledgement into their procedure. A confession obtained under torture was required to be repeated voluntarily, without torture, at a later hearing in order to be valid. What the system failed to adequately account for was that a person who had been tortured once knew very well what awaited them if they retracted their confession at the subsequent hearing. And this knowledge shaped the voluntary repetition of the confession in ways that compromised its voluntariness considerably. Historians still argue whether this procedural safeguard represented a genuine attempt to address the reliability problem or a legalistic fiction that provided institutional cover for a practice whose actual purpose was less about information and more about the demonstration of state power. The psychological dimension of the torture apparatus deserves as much attention as the physical one, perhaps more, because the most sophisticated thing about the medieval interrogation system was not any particular device but the use of anticipation as a tool in its own right. Canon law in the ecclesiastical court system, the Church's parallel legal apparatus, which handled a wide range of offenses including heresy, specified that the accused must be shown the instruments of torture before they were applied, and given an opportunity to confess without their use. This provision was framed as a mercy, an opportunity for voluntary compliance, but it was also, in practice, a psychological technique of considerable effectiveness. The showing of instruments produced, in many cases, confessions without any physical application at all, which the legal system counted as voluntary confessions uncomplicated by the reliability problems of pain-induced testimony. Whether a confession produced by the threat of torture and the sight of the apparatus was meaningfully more voluntary than one produced by its application was another question that the medieval legal mind was capable of parsing with impressive theoretical precision while declining to let the parsing get in the way of the conviction. If you are brought to this room, and you may not be because not every prisoner is, and the decision about who gets interrogated formally and who simply sits in the dungeon until their case resolves by some other mechanism depends on factors that include the seriousness of the alleged offense, the political importance of the person pressing charges, the available evidence, and the specific practices of the jurisdiction you are in. If you are brought here, the experience begins with a period that is not the application of anything. It is a conversation, a legally structured conversation with specific questions, asked by a legally authorized questioner who may be a professional lawyer, a judge, a church official, or simply an experienced dungeon employee depending on the context, but who is following a procedure and documenting the responses. You are asked to confirm your name, your offense, your circumstances. You are reminded of the gravity of your situation. You are offered, with a formality that is somewhat terrible in its courtesy, the opportunity to tell the truth and spare yourself the rest. What you say in this conversation will be written down. This is important. The documentation of torture proceedings in medieval Europe is among the most detailed, and in some ways most disturbing archival material that survives from the period, because the legal requirement to record the proceedings produced transcripts of interrogations that preserve, in the flat administrative language of the notary, exchanges that are among the most humanly raw documents in the historical record. Inquisition trial records, court torture proceedings, records of heresy investigations, these documents record questions and answers, the notary's note when the prisoner cried out, the official statement that the prisoner was shown the instruments and given the opportunity to confess, the record of what was then done when the opportunity was declined. They are read by historians today with the specific kind of attention that you give to documents that contain the compressed, bureaucratically mediated echo of real human suffering. The chamber itself, when you see it, is almost certainly smaller and less elaborately equipped than you imagined. Stone walls as everywhere. A brazier for heat which serves multiple purposes, warmth for the officials, the heating of implements when necessary, and the psychological function of being a brazier in a room where you are about to be questioned under compulsion. A table for the notary. Rope, prominently available. Whatever else the specific establishment maintains, which varies. The officials in the room are doing their jobs. This is, in some ways, the most difficult thing to sit with. Not that there are cruel people in the room, though there may be, but that the machinery works perfectly well without cruelty. Driven simply by procedure and professional obligation, and the straightforward institutional goal of obtaining a confession in a case where a confession is legally required. The torturer, where there is one, is a functionary. In some cities, the role was a municipal position with a salary, benefits in the form of accommodation, and a professional expectation of discretion. The medieval torturer who appears in popular history as a figure of sadistic relish was certainly not unknown, but was probably not the modal case. The modal case was a person doing a defined job in a defined legal context, following specified procedures, and going home afterward to whatever their life contained outside the chamber. Historians still argue whether this bureaucratic normality makes the practice better or worse than the sadistic version, and it is not a debate with a clean resolution. You will say what you say. What you say will be written down. The notary's pen scratches on the parchment with a sound that is somehow the most present sound in the room, more present than anything else, the sound of your situation becoming permanent, becoming record, becoming the document that someone will read in an archive 700 years from now with careful scholarly attention and a particular quality of silence. After it is over, whatever form overtakes, you will be returned to the dungeon. Not to a different space, not to improved conditions as a reward for cooperation, but to the same cell, the same dark, the same cold, the same rats who have by now accepted your presence with the equanimity of creatures who were never particularly concerned about it to begin with. You will be returned to the inventory of the place. The dripping water, the scratch marks in the walls you cannot see, the bowl pushed through the slot at intervals that mark the passage of time in the only units the dungeon offers. Your body will feel different than it did before, in ways that range from immediately apparent to slowly emerging over the following days and weeks. Medieval prisoners who survived formal interrogation and returned to general dungeon population carried the physical evidence of the procedure with them in ways that other prisoners could read. In the specific literacy of people who live close enough to suffering to have developed a vocabulary for its varieties. The dungeon receives you back without comment. It is very good at that. The body has been keeping score since the moment you arrived, and it is time to look at the tally. Not the dramatic, visible damage of formal interrogation. We have just come from that room and its particular accounting, but the quieter, more patient damage that the dungeon inflicts through the simple, sustained application of its baseline conditions: the cold, the damp, the inadequate food, the contaminated water, the biological community you share your cell with, and the specific physiological cruelties of a space that was built to contain human beings without any meaningful interest in keeping them functional. This damage is cumulative and it is compounding, which means that each individual insult to your body is made worse by every other insult occurring simultaneously. And the timeline of your physical deterioration is not a straight line but an accelerating curve that begins slowly enough to feel manageable and ends in places that feel anything but. Let us start with the cold, because the cold started first and has not stopped. Your core body temperature, the temperature of your internal organs and blood, is maintained within an extraordinarily narrow range by a suite of physiological mechanisms that work continuously and consume energy to do so. When the environmental temperature drops below what your body can comfortably maintain without effort, these mechanisms intensify their work. You shiver, which is your muscles generating heat through rapid involuntary contraction. Your blood vessels in your extremities constrict, redirecting circulation toward your core to protect your vital organs at the expense of your fingers, toes, and ears. Your metabolic rate increases, burning through your caloric reserves faster than your inadequate ration can replenish them. All of this is happening in your body right now, has been happening continuously since you arrived, and the energy cost of it is being drawn from reserves that are already being depleted by the baseline caloric deficit of dungeon rations. The practical consequence is that you are burning through your body stores faster than a person in a thermally comfortable environment would, which means that the nutritional inadequacy of your rations is functionally worse than it would be in better conditions. The 500 to 700 calories per meal we calculated earlier were already insufficient for a sedentary adult in a warm room. In a cold, damp dungeon cell where your body is running its heating systems continuously, those calories are even more inadequate, and the gap between intake and requirement widens further with every degree the temperature drops, which in winter, even underground, it continues to do. Hypothermia, the clinical reduction of core body temperature below the range necessary for normal physiological function, was almost certainly a cause of death in medieval dungeon populations that was systematically underreported, partly because medieval medicine had no precise diagnostic framework for it, and partly because the administrative record of dungeon deaths was not kept with the kind of specificity that would distinguish between hypothermia and the various other things that killed prisoners. A prisoner found dead in a cell would typically be recorded as having died of illness, or of natural causes, or sometimes simply as having died, with no further elaboration. The specific mechanism was irrelevant to the record keeper and relevant only to the body, which was no longer in a position to advocate for accurate documentation. But hypothermia, while it was the most dramatic cold-related outcome, was less common than the chronic conditions that the cold produced in prisoners who survived. Chilblains, the inflammation of small blood vessels in the skin caused by repeated exposure to cold without freezing, producing swollen, itching, painful patches typically on the hands, feet, and ears, were essentially universal in dungeon populations kept through winter months. They are not life-threatening in themselves, but they are persistently miserable, and in the specific context of a dungeon environment where you are already dealing with flea bites and louse irritation and the general dermatological consequences of not washing, they add to a skin-level experience of your own body that is continuously and inescapably unpleasant. Your hands itch in a way that is different from the flea bite itch, deeper and more diffuse, and scratching them produces a brief and entirely counterproductive relief followed by increased inflammation and occasionally broken skin, which in the dungeon environment is a broken skin that is going to have considerable difficulty healing and considerable opportunity to become infected. Infection is where the dungeon's various insults to your body begin to converge into something more serious, and it is where we need to talk about the complete absence of anything recognizable as medical care. Medieval medicine was not simply primitive in the way that a less developed version of modern medicine would be primitive. It operated from an entirely different theoretical framework, the humoral system, which understood health as the balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and disease as an imbalance between them, that led its practitioners to interventions that ranged from ineffective to actively harmful when applied to the conditions a dungeon prisoner was developing. Bloodletting, the most widely applied medical intervention of the medieval period, removed from an already nutritionally depleted, cold-stressed body the one resource it was working hardest to conserve, with predictably unhelpful results. More to the point, medical care of any kind was not a standard feature of dungeon provision. In the ecclesiastical establishments, where the monastic tradition included a genuine commitment to care of the sick, prisoners who became seriously ill might receive some attention from the institution's infirmarian. In secular dungeons, especially the lower-grade variety that most prisoners inhabited, there was no medical professional available and no particular institutional expectation that one should be. If you became ill in your cell, and the illness progressed or resolved according to its own biological logic, with no intervention from anyone except the minimal and unreliable one of the food slot opening twice a day whether you were capable of reaching it or not. The waterborne illness that your contaminated water supply has been slowly establishing in your digestive system is now making itself known in a way that requires your full attention and produces, in the specific context of a cell with inadequate sanitation, a secondary set of problems that layer misery upon misery with a thoroughness that is almost impressive. Dysentery, bacterial infection of the intestinal tract, producing severe diarrhea, cramping, and in serious cases bloody stool, was endemic in medieval confined populations and moved through dungeon communities with a speed that reflected the density of occupation and the impossibility of maintaining any meaningful hygiene. A single prisoner with active dysentery in a shared cell was, within a few days, a vector for the entire cell's population, because the bacteria responsible traveled via the fecal-oral route and the dungeon environment provided essentially no barriers to that transmission. The dehydration produced by severe diarrhea was, in the dungeon context, particularly dangerous, because your water supply was the source of the infection and drinking more of it while your gut was compromised was both necessary for survival and contributory to the continuation of the illness. This is the kind of physiological trap that medieval prisoners had no conceptual framework for understanding but experienced in full physical force. Drink and stay hydrated while potentially worsening the infection, or don't drink and dehydrate, and both options lead somewhere bad at different speeds. Here is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it carries genuine historical weight. Jail fever, which is the historical name for the epidemic typhus transmitted by body lice that we mentioned briefly in the section on your cellmates, was responsible for more prisoner deaths in medieval and early modern European confinement than any other single cause, including execution. It was also responsible, in a significant number of documented cases, for killing the people running the trials, judges, lawyers, court officials, jury members, who came into contact with prisoners carrying the louse population responsible for transmission. There are recorded instances of assize courts in medieval and early modern England where a prisoner brought from dungeon conditions infected the entire court, and the resulting epidemic killed members of the judiciary and legal profession at rates that got the attention of authorities in a way that prisoner deaths alone consistently failed to do. The installation of specific aromatic herbs and flowers in English courtrooms, the practice of strewing herbs, which gave us the term nosegay, was partly a response to this documented risk, an attempt to manage through pleasant smells an epidemic process whose actual mechanism was entirely misunderstood, but whose association with prisoners from confined conditions was empirically observed. Typhus presents initially as fever, headache, and a general malaise that is difficult to distinguish from a dozen other conditions your body might be developing simultaneously. Within a week, a characteristic rash appears on the trunk, spreading outward, and the fever intensifies. The neurological symptoms, confusion, disorientation, the specific cognitive disruption that gives typhus its historical association with madness in confined populations, develop in the second week and can be severe enough to produce hallucinations and delirium in patients who survive long enough to reach that stage. The mortality rate from epidemic typhus in pre-antibiotic populations varied with circumstances but ran between 10 and 40% in documented outbreaks, and the dungeon population, with its compromised immune systems and its guaranteed exposure to the louse vector, was at the severe end of that range. You have a fever. You may not know it yet because fever in a cold environment can be masked by the baseline discomfort of simply being cold. The subjective experience of being hot when your environment is cold is confusing in ways that delay self-diagnosis, but your body knows it. Your heart rate is elevated. Your thinking, which has been operating under the cumulative cognitive burden of sleep deprivation, nutritional deficit, and sustained psychological stress, has become slightly less sharp, slightly less reliable, in a way that is difficult to detect from the inside because the instrument of detection is itself the thing that is degrading. The quirky and genuinely strange historical tidbit for this section is this: medieval physicians who had occasion to treat or observe prisoners returning from long confinement. Rare enough, but documented in a number of medical and legal texts, described a specific constellation of symptoms that they called, in various formulations, dungeon sickness or prison fever, distinct from other fevers in its presentation and its characteristic association with confinement conditions. Their descriptions, filtered through the humoral theoretical framework, are sometimes difficult to map precisely onto modern diagnostic categories, but the constellation they describe, the fever, the skin manifestations, the cognitive disturbance, the extreme physical weakness, the specific smell that contemporary accounts mention repeatedly as distinctive, maps with reasonable confidence onto typhus in most cases and onto a combination of nutritional deficiency diseases in others. What is remarkable is that medieval medical observers were accurate enough in their clinical observation to identify dungeon sickness as a specific entity, even without any theory that could explain it, which is a reminder that careful empirical observation can produce valid clinical knowledge well in advance of the theoretical framework that eventually explains it. Your skin has become a document of your time in this place in ways that are visible to anyone who looks, though in the dark no one is looking and you cannot see yourself. The flea bites have accumulated into a landscape of small, inflamed points across your lower legs, ankles, and waist, some of which have been scratched open and are in various stages of the infection-inflammation cycle. The chilblains on your hands and feet have progressed from the initial itching phase to something more painful and more structural, the tissue genuinely swollen and in places beginning to crack. Your gums, if you could examine them, would show the early signs of the tissue changes associated with vitamin C deficiency, scurvy, which develops in human beings deprived of fresh fruits and vegetables over a period of weeks to months, and whose initial oral manifestations include swollen, tender, bleeding gums that are the forerunner of the more dramatic systemic symptoms that develop if the deficiency continues. The absence of vitamin C in dungeon rations was not a deliberate policy choice so much as an inevitable consequence of feeding people on the cheapest possible version of the cheapest possible foods, which meant primarily grain-based products that were stored, processed, and cooked in ways that destroyed what little vitamin C they might have contained. Fresh vegetables and fruits, which were the primary dietary sources of vitamin C in the medieval diet, were expensive, seasonally limited, and not a standard feature of anyone's thinking about prisoner nutrition. The result was that prisoners held for more than a few weeks were reliably developing early-stage scurvy by the time anyone might have occasion to look at their gums, and prisoners held for months were progressing toward the more advanced stages, joint pain, fatigue so profound it becomes indistinguishable from paralysis, wounds that refuse to heal because collagen synthesis requires vitamin C, and collagen is what holds wounds closed, that medieval observers described in the returning prisoner accounts with enough consistency to constitute a clinical pattern, even without the biochemical explanation. Sleep is not happening properly and has not been for however long you have been here, and this deserves explicit attention because sleep deprivation is one of the dungeon's most insidious tools precisely because it is invisible, because it happens passively, because no one has to do anything to impose it on you. The environment simply makes adequate sleep physiologically impossible and lets the consequences accumulate. The cold alone is sufficient to prevent the deep sleep stages that the body requires for immune function restoration, memory consolidation, and hormonal regulation. Add the intermittent noise of the rat population, the physical discomfort of the surface you are sleeping on, the pain of your accumulating skin conditions, the gastrointestinal disruption of incipient infection, and the fever that may or may not be developing, and you have a sleep environment that produces something closer to a series of brief unconscious interludes than anything resembling restorative rest. The immune system runs its critical maintenance and restoration processes during deep sleep. Deny the deep sleep and you compromise the immune restoration, which means the body's capacity to fight the infections it is being exposed to is diminished precisely when the infectious burden is highest, which accelerates the progression of the infections, which increases the physiological stress that disrupts sleep, which further compromises immune function, in a loop that the dungeon environment establishes and maintains without requiring any active management from anyone. You are lying on your side because the stone is too hard for any other position to be sustainable for more than a few minutes. There is straw under you, there was straw when you arrived, pushed into a corner, and you have redistributed it as best you could in the dark to create something that is technically a pallet if you are using the word loosely and charitably. The straw is damp. The straw smells. The straw contains the full biological community you have by now become well acquainted with, and it is warm enough, barely, when you curl into it, that the warmth justifies the rest of the package. Your breathing is slightly faster than it should be at rest. Your heart is working slightly harder than it should be at rest. Your body is conducting multiple emergency response programs simultaneously, all of them drawing from the same diminishing reserve of resources, all of them partly succeeding and partly failing, all of them producing as a byproduct the subjective experience of being not quite right, of being slightly removed from yourself, of watching your own cognition from a small distance and noticing with the detached interest of a person who has run out of alarm that it is not performing at its best. This is what illness in the dungeon feels like from the inside, before it becomes dramatic, before it becomes the thing that medieval observers recorded as dungeon fever in their clinical notes and their chronicles and their legal documents and their letters. It feels mostly like everything has gotten slightly worse than it was yesterday, in a direction that has been consistent since you arrived, in a gradient that is shallow enough to accommodate hope but steep enough, when you do the patient arithmetic of it, to produce conclusions you would rather not reach while lying on damp straw in the dark with a fever you cannot quite confirm you have, listening to rats and water and the breathing of other people who are doing the same arithmetic in the same dark and arriving, you suspect, at similar conclusions. The food slot opens. The bowl comes through. You make yourself move toward it, which is harder today than it was yesterday. The pottage is warm. You hold it in both hands for longer than you need to, because the warmth is still the closest thing to comfort that this place provides, and comfort, however inadequate, is still worth taking when it is offered. You eat. You drink the water. You make the choice that every prisoner in every dungeon has had to make, the choice between the risk of the water and the certainty of the thirst, and you make it the same way they all did, the same way you will continue to make it until either the water stops making you sick or you stop being here, whichever comes first. The bowl is empty. You put it by the slot. The dark continues. Your body continues its quiet, urgent, largely invisible work of trying to keep you alive in a place that was not designed with that goal in mind. Outside, somewhere unreachably above, it might be raining or sunny or cold, or the first tentative warmth of an early spring. You will not know which. The dungeon maintains its constant, indifferent temperature regardless, sealed against the seasons, sealed against the news, sealed against all the ordinary information that the world offers freely to everyone who is not here. You close your eyes, which changes nothing about the quality of the darkness but feels, nevertheless, like a decision, like a small voluntary act in a life that has been largely stripped of those. Something in your chest rattles slightly when you breathe. You note it, you file it, and you breathe again carefully the way you do everything now. The mind is the last thing the dungeon comes for, and it is the most patient about it. Everything else, the cold, the hunger, the illness, the physical diminishment that has been accumulating in your body with the quiet persistence of interest on a debt. All of that arrived relatively quickly and made itself known in terms that were immediate and concrete and possible, in their own awful way to take stock of. You could feel the cold. You could feel the hunger. You could track the flea bites and the chilblains and the fever's slow tide in and out. These were things happening to a body, and even when they were happening badly, the body's experience of them retained a kind of specificity that kept it, and you inside it, anchored in something real. What the dungeon does to the mind is different. It is slower. It is less obviously dramatic in its early stages and considerably more dramatic in its later ones. And it operates not by adding something unbearable, but by removing things you did not know you needed until they were gone, by hollowing out the architecture of your interior life with a subtlety that means you are well into the process before you have any clear sense that the process has begun. By the time most prisoners could articulate what was happening to their minds, a significant portion of the happening had already occurred. This is not a flaw in the dungeon's design. It is the design. Let us begin with what has been taken from you, because inventory is a useful way to approach this, and because the dungeon has, ironically, made you very good at inventory. It has taken light, which we addressed early and thoroughly, but whose cognitive consequences we have not yet fully examined. Human beings are not merely inconvenienced by darkness. We are cognitively dependent on visual input in ways that go well beyond simple navigation. Vision is the dominant sense in the human perceptual hierarchy. The brain devotes more processing resources to visual information than to all other sensory channels combined, and when that input is removed, not temporarily, not with the promise of imminent restoration, but as a permanent baseline condition, the brain does not simply shift resources to the remaining senses and carry on. It begins, gradually, to lose its grip on certain categories of information that it normally updates continuously through visual input. Spatial reasoning is one of the first casualties. Your sense of where your body is in space, its orientation, its posture, its relationship to the surfaces around it, is normally a collaboration between your visual system, your vestibular system in the inner ear, and your proprioceptive system, the network of sensors in your muscles and joints that report on position and movement. In normal conditions, these three systems cross-check each other constantly, and the result is a seamless, automatic sense of embodied location that you never have to think about. In sustained darkness, the visual component drops out of that collaboration, and the remaining two systems, which were never designed to operate alone, begin to produce results that are subtly and sometimes dramatically wrong. You will have moments, especially in the hypnagogic state between waking and sleep, where you cannot determine with confidence which way is up, where the wall you are leaning against feels, for a disorienting instant, like the floor, where your sense of the cell's dimensions becomes uncertain in a way that makes the space feel alternately vast and crushingly small. These experiences are brief and resolve quickly when you move and reestablish contact with the physical environment, but they are unsettling in proportion to their frequency, and their frequency tends to increase as the deprivation continues. Time, which we have discussed as a practical problem from the beginning, has become something more than a practical problem now. In the early days, the loss of time sense was an inconvenience. You did not know whether it was morning or evening, could not track the days with confidence, had to build your temporal framework from footstep patterns and the unreliable rhythms of your own hunger. That was disorienting, but it was workable. What is happening now is different in kind. The problem is no longer that you have lost the ability to measure time accurately. It is that time itself has begun to behave differently as a subjective experience, in ways that your pre-dungeon conceptual vocabulary does not have adequate words for. Psychologists studying sensory deprivation in experimental contexts, beginning seriously in the 1950s and continuing through decades of research that has generated both genuine scientific knowledge and a considerable amount of ethical controversy about the research methods employed, have documented a consistent pattern in subjects deprived of sensory input and temporal cues over extended periods. The subjective experience of duration becomes unmoored from its normal relationship with external events. Long periods feel short. Short periods feel endless. The past becomes simultaneously vivid and unreliable. Memories intensify in detail and emotional charge while losing their sequential relationship to each other, so that you may find yourself experiencing a memory of something from your childhood with a presence and immediacy that makes it feel more real than the stone wall your hand is resting on, and then finding that you cannot reliably locate that memory in the chronology of your life, cannot say with confidence whether it happened before or after something else. The future, normally the mind's great project, the planning, the anticipating, the narrative of what comes next, collapses into an undefined and unnavigable distance that thinking about produces something between blankness and panic and that you have learned to avoid approaching directly. This is your mainstream historical fact for this section, and it comes from a source that brings the theoretical into sharp human focus, the philosopher and scholar Boethius, imprisoned in 523 AD by the Ostrogothic king Theodoric under charges of treason and senatorial conspiracy, wrote his most celebrated work, The Consolation of Philosophy, while awaiting execution in a cell in Pavia. The Consolation is many things: a philosophical dialogue, a meditation on fortune and virtue, a work of genuine intellectual beauty, but it is also, if you read it with attention to its context, a document of what a specific, extraordinarily well-equipped human mind did when it was placed in a cell and stripped of its normal external world and told to wait for death. Boethius constructed an entire philosophical universe from the inside, populated it with a personified philosophy who came to visit him and argue with him and comfort him, and wrote it all down in alternating prose and verse with a structural elegance that suggests the dungeon, for this one remarkable prisoner, became a kind of enforced creative space. This is the extreme positive outlier of the dungeon mind experience, the version that produced something that people still read 1500 years later, and it is mentioned here not as a model or a comfort but as evidence that the human mind, under the most extreme constraints, retains a capacity for interior construction that is both its greatest defense and, when it turns in less productive directions, its greatest vulnerability. Because the interior construction is not always Boethius. The interior construction, for most prisoners in most dungeons, was something considerably more turbulent. The mind deprived of external input does not simply rest. It generates. It produces content from its own stores, memories, fears, desires, fragments of conversation, faces of people not present, sounds that were heard long ago and have been replaying ever since. This generative activity is, in moderate doses, a coping mechanism. It is your mind keeping itself company in the absence of external company, and the early stages of it feel relatively benign. You think about your family, you replay pleasant memories, you make plans that you know are contingent on a release that may not come but that the planning itself makes feel more real. This is recognizable and human and not particularly alarming. The later stages are different. When the generative activity has been running without external correction for long enough, without the continuous reality testing that normal sensory experience provides, without the social feedback of other people who share your consensual reality and can confirm or contradict your perceptions, it begins to drift from the territory of deliberate memory and imagination into something harder to control and harder to distinguish from perception. The visual system, deprived of input and still devoting its enormous processing resources to something, begins to generate content more vivid and autonomous than the voluntary imagery of deliberate remembering. Sounds that are clearly produced by the environment, the rats, the water, the stone, begin to carry meanings that intellectually, they cannot carry, but that some part of your perceptual system keeps insisting they do. The faces of people you know and love begin to appear in the darkness with a clarity that the darkness should make impossible, and for a moment that is longer than you would like it to be, You are not entirely certain whether you are seeing something or remembering something or generating something, and the uncertainty itself is frightening in a way that the darkness alone was not. The quirky and deeply human tidbit here is this: there is a documented tradition, across multiple medieval cultures and multiple religious frameworks, of imprisoned individuals reporting visions that were interpreted within their cultural context as supernatural visitations, saints, angels, divine presences, and that their surrounding communities, when they eventually heard these accounts, received as genuine mystical experiences rather than as symptoms of sensory deprivation and psychological stress. Some of these accounts became the foundation of significant religious narratives. Some of the people who reported them were subsequently canonized. Historians still argue with considerable delicacy whether these visionary experiences were genuine religious phenomena, psychologically generated content mistaken for external reality, or some combination of the two that the categories available to us are inadequate to resolve, and the argument tends to generate heat precisely because the stakes are not merely historical. What is not in dispute is that the dungeon, the sensory deprivation tank of the medieval world, was consistently productive of experiences that the people who had them found transformative, and that the line between the saint's cell and the prisoner's cell was architecturally, sometimes not a line at all. Solitary confinement, where it occurred, accelerated all of these processes considerably, and medieval jailers understood this empirically if not theoretically. Placing a prisoner in isolation, cutting off even the limited social contact of a shared cell, was used deliberately in cases where the goal was to produce a particular psychological state. Compliance, confession, the willingness to cooperate with whatever the authority above wanted. The effectiveness of this technique was well established by observation long before modern psychology developed the vocabulary to explain why it worked, and the explanation, when it came, was both straightforward and disturbing. Human beings are social animals in a neurological sense that goes deeper than preference or habit. Social contact is not a comfort added to a functional life. It is a component of functional cognition. The brain uses other people as external cognitive resources, for reality testing, for emotional regulation, for the maintenance of the narrative self that requires an audience to remain coherent. Remove other people entirely and the brain begins to lose access to these resources, and the consequences show up in cognition, in emotional regulation, and eventually in the stability of the self as a continuous, bounded, coherent entity. This last consequence, the destabilization of the bounded self, is the one that the medieval sources describe most obliquely and most consistently. The language is different. Prisoners who returned from long solitary confinement were described as not being themselves, as having lost something that was hard to name, as being present in body but absent in some other register that the observers had trouble specifying. Modern psychology would describe what they were observing as a dissociative response, a partial detachment of consciousness from the body and from continuous autobiographical experience, a protective fragmentation that the psyche produces under conditions of sustained unbearable stress. The medieval observer saw a person who was and was not the person they remembered, and reached for whatever explanatory framework their culture provided, spiritual, humoral, moral, to account for the gap. The emotional landscape of the dungeon mind, in the weeks and months of confinement, moves through recognizable stages that are documented with sufficient consistency across the historical sources to constitute a pattern. The initial acute distress, the fear, the anger, the active grief of separation from everything familiar, gives way, typically within the first week or two, to something flatter and more pervasive. The clinical term is anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure, and it develops in conditions of sustained stress as the neurochemical systems responsible for pleasure and reward become dysregulated by the continuous activation of the stress response. In the dungeon, anhedonia arrives not as a dramatic emotional event but as a gradual graying of experience. The pottage stops provoking the small comfort it once did. The warmth of the bowl registers less. The memories that once provided interior relief become harder to access and less vivid when accessed. The planning and hoping that filled early confinement becomes less available as the mind's investment in a future that keeps failing to arrive naturally diminishes. What replaces it is harder to describe from the outside and is described, in the accounts that survive, with the specific imprecision of people trying to communicate an interior experience for which their language was not designed. A heaviness, a slowing, a sense of the self becoming gradually less distinct from its container, the boundaries between the person and the stone becoming, not physically, but experientially, less clear. Medieval prisoners who wrote about this experience, and they were the exceptional ones, the literate, the resourced, the ones whose accounts survived specifically because they were already people whose words mattered, described it in terms of loss, of subtraction, of becoming less rather than more, and they described the effort required to resist it as the central labor of confinement, more exhausting than any physical discomfort, more demanding than hunger or cold, because it was the labor of maintaining the self in conditions specifically designed to dissolve it. You are doing this labor right now. You may not know that you are doing it because the most exhausting labor is often the kind you cannot see yourself performing. But every time you arrange the bowl by the slot, every time you track the rat by sound, every time you compose in your mind a sentence addressed to someone outside who cannot hear you, every time you run your fingers along the scratch marks in the wall and try to imagine the person who made them, you are doing it. You are insisting, against the architecture, on being someone specific and continuous, a person with a past that connects to this present and a future that extends beyond this cell, a person whose interior life is not reducible to the cold and the dark and the dripping water. However comprehensively those things currently dominate your sensory experience. It is exhausting work. It is also, the evidence suggests, the work that survival most fundamentally depends on. The prisoners who came out of long medieval confinement with their minds most intact were not universally the strongest or the healthiest or the best fed. They were, by the accounts of observers who met them after release, the ones who had found ways to maintain interior activity. Prayer, memory, composition, counting, the patient construction of an interior world that the dungeon could not reach, and had applied themselves to it with the discipline that their exterior life now entirely lacked. The dungeon gave them nothing to do. They made the work themselves, from nothing, in the dark. There is something in that which is, if not comforting exactly, then at least not entirely without dignity. The dark continues. The water drips. Your mind, which is the last room the dungeon cannot lock, goes on furnishing itself as best it can, with whatever materials are available, in whatever light it can generate from its own diminishing but still burning resources. It is enough for tonight. It will have to be. There is a morning, and you know it is morning, genuinely know it, not from any external signal but from the specific quality of your own waking, the way consciousness returns to you with a slightly different texture than it has on the mornings that preceded it, something marginally less heavy. A barely perceptible shift in the dungeon's ambient sound that your now finely calibrated senses register before your thinking mind has fully assembled itself. There is a morning when the footsteps on the stairs are different again. Not the food footsteps, not the warden's footsteps, not the heavy purposeful descent that you have learned to read with an accuracy that would have seemed impossible to you on your first day here. These footsteps are hesitant in a way that none of the others have been. They pause on the stairs. They consult each other in lowered voices that carry through the stone as a murmur without content. And then the key turns in the lock, and the door opens, and the light comes in, and someone says your name. Your name. Not prisoner. Not you. Your actual name. The one that belongs to the person you were before the dungeon began its long work of renegotiating that person's terms of existence. The sound of it is strange in a way you will spend a long time afterward trying to articulate. It is like hearing a word in a language you were fluent in and have been away from long enough that the fluency has developed a slight lag, a half-second delay between the sound and the meaning, during which the sound is just a sound and the meaning is just arriving. This is the section about getting out, or not getting out, or getting out in the various forms that out took in the medieval world, which were more various and more complicated than the simple binary of freedom and continued imprisonment suggests, and which carried their own particular burdens that the dungeon, in its thoroughness, had not entirely prepared you for. Let us begin with the ways out that existed, because understanding the landscape of possibility is the necessary foundation for understanding what any particular exit actually meant. Medieval imprisonment ended through a relatively small number of mechanisms, and they were not equally available to all prisoners, were not equally likely, and did not lead to equally livable destinations. Ransom was the most straightforward for those who qualified, and we established early on that you do not qualify in the way that a captured knight or a noble hostage qualifies, though versions of ransom existed further down the social scale. A debt prisoner, for instance, could in theory be released when the debt was paid, and families sometimes pooled resources to settle the obligation that had put their member in the cell. The payment of a fine, which was the medieval justice system's most commonly applied resolution to offenses below the capital threshold, served a similar function. You paid or someone paid for you, and the payment discharged the claim the system had on your body, and the door opened. Royal or seigneurial pardon was another route, and it was one that operated in the specific political logic of medieval governance with a directness that the modern concept of pardon somewhat obscures. A medieval pardon was not primarily a statement about guilt or innocence. It was a political instrument, an act of lordly grace that demonstrated the power of the pardoner by the very act of remitting a punishment that was theirs to remit. Pardons were issued in bulk at significant political moments: coronations, royal births, major religious festivals, military victories. A general pardon might free dozens or hundreds of prisoners simultaneously, not because their cases had been reviewed and found wanting, but because the political moment called for a demonstration of magnanimity, and the prison population was the available material for that demonstration. If you happened to be in a dungeon when a general pardon was issued, your release was essentially accidental, a function of timing rather than justice, and the arbitrariness of it was, in the medieval framework, not a flaw in the system but an expression of how the system was supposed to work. Trial and acquittal was a route out, though one whose availability and reliability varied enormously by jurisdiction, offense, and the period in question. The medieval legal systems of Europe were neither uniformly barbaric nor uniformly fair, but were, more accurately, inconsistent in ways that made the outcome of any particular case dependent on a constellation of factors that included the strength of the evidence, the skill and motivation of anyone arguing on your behalf, the specific predispositions of the judge or judges, the political climate surrounding your particular offense, and the degree to which your case had attracted attention from people with the power to influence its resolution. High-profile cases with politically interested parties on both sides could drag through multiple hearings over months or years, with the prisoner sitting in the dungeon throughout. Low-profile cases might be resolved quickly by a single official with broad authority and no particular interest in extended deliberation. Escape was a route out that existed more prominently in narrative than in statistical reality. Medieval dungeons were not escape-proof in the way that the architecture was intended to make them, and the historical record does contain genuine escape accounts that are often quite remarkable. Tunneling through mortar that had softened with moisture over years, bribing guards with promises that the prisoner subsequently honored or did not, concealing oneself in a delivery cart, disguising oneself in borrowed clothing, exploiting the specific gap between a corrupt keeper's negligence and the lord's actual level of attention to dungeon management. The Tower of London alone has a documented escape history that reads like a catalogue of human ingenuity applied to the specific problem of not being in the Tower of London anymore. But for every documented escape, the records suggest dozens of attempts that failed and went unrecorded because failed escapes were not interesting enough to chronicle, and the punishment for a failed escape was severe enough to make the calculus unattractive to all but the most desperate or the most resourced. Death was a route out, and the most common one for prisoners held without the resources to buy better conditions or the political connections to accelerate their case. We have spent considerable time in the previous sections documenting the mechanisms by which the dungeon killed: the cold, the nutritional deficiency, the waterborne illness, the typhus moving through louse populations, the infections born of inadequate sanitation and no medical care, the psychological deterioration that removed the will to eat, to move, to maintain the interior resistance that survival required. Death in the dungeon was rarely dramatic. It was usually the final chapter of the slow accumulation narrative we have been following. The body that had been managing multiple simultaneous insults for weeks or months simply running out of the reserve required to continue managing, and stopping in the night without announcement, becoming a stillness among the other stillnesses of the cell that was discovered at the next feeding or the next inspection, or whenever the absence of the living body's small distinctive sounds registered to someone whose job it was to notice. Your mainstream historical fact for this final section is one that reframes the entire dungeon experience in a particular light. Demographic historians studying medieval English prison records, the most detailed that survive for the period, have estimated that somewhere between 15 and 30% of prisoners held in common dungeon conditions for more than 3 months died before any legal resolution of their case. This was not the result of execution or deliberate killing. It was the result of the baseline conditions of confinement applied to bodies that were already, in many cases, nutritionally marginal before imprisonment and that the dungeon then systematically depleted. The dungeon did not need to do anything extraordinary to produce a mortality rate of this magnitude. It simply needed to be itself consistently over time. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities were aware of this mortality rate and accepted it as an implicit policy outcome, or whether the deaths were genuinely not tracked closely enough to produce the kind of aggregate awareness that would constitute policy. And the argument matters because its resolution determines whether what happened in medieval dungeons was negligence or something that requires a different and heavier word. But you are not a statistic this morning. You are the person whose name was just spoken, who is sitting in the light of a torch that someone is holding steady for you with what appears, startlingly, to be consideration, and who is being told something in a voice that is slower and clearer than the voices in this place are usually deployed. Something that contains the words released and arrangements and whenever you are ready, which is a phrase so foreign to the vocabulary of this space that it takes you several full seconds to parse it. Whenever you are ready. You are not ready. You will not be ready for some time, in ways that go considerably beyond the immediate physical logistics of standing up, which is itself going to require assistance that you accept without the embarrassment you might have felt about it once. Because the dungeon has efficiently removed from you most of the vanities that stood between you and the acceptance of necessary help. Your legs, which have spent weeks or months in a cell too small for adequate movement, have a relationship with sustained weight-bearing that is going to need renegotiation. Your eyes, emerging into torchlight and shortly into daylight, are going to experience the world's normal luminosity as something close to painful for longer than you would expect. Your body, which has been operating on dungeon rations in dungeon temperatures for however long it has been, is going to communicate its various accumulated complaints with an articulacy that the numbing routine of imprisonment had been partly suppressing. And the relief of departure is going to be accompanied by a paradoxical intensification of physical awareness that is the body's version of a debriefing. The stairs. You have been listening to these stairs for the entirety of your confinement, have built a detailed auditory model of them that turns out to be reasonably accurate. There are more of them than you expected, and they are steeper, and there is a turn partway up that your mental model had placed slightly lower. The turn matters because it is where the light changes, where the torch in whoever's hand is supplemented by a thread of actual daylight coming from somewhere above. And the first encounter with that thread is the kind of moment that resists description not because language lacks the vocabulary but because the experience sits in a register that language approaches from outside rather than from within. It is just light. Ordinary, ambient, overcast daylight, the kind that on any normal day you would not notice at all. But your retinas, which have been operating in complete darkness for however long it has been, receive it as something for which ordinary is simply not the right category. The world resolves, slowly, painfully, with a blooming and then a gradual focusing, into shapes and distances and the specific textures of stone that you have only ever known by touch. The stairs are gray. The walls are gray and brown, and in places green with the moss you have been smelling for weeks. There is a doorway above you. Through the doorway there is a courtyard. In the courtyard there is sky. The sky is the thing. The sky is too large. Your spatial processing, recalibrated over weeks to the dimensions of a dungeon cell, encounters the open sky with a vertiginous shock that sends you leaning against the wall of the staircase, not from weakness or not only from weakness, but from the sheer perceptual enormity of a space without a ceiling. The person accompanying you waits. They have done this before or seen it done, or simply have the presence of mind to recognize that this moment requires patience rather than hurry. You breathe outside air which is nothing like the air below. It carries everything. The smell of horses and cook fires and cold mud and something green and growing somewhere. The ordinary saturated complexity of the world's smell after the dungeon's monotone. And it is so overwhelmingly much that your eyes water, which you will later, if you ever tell this story, be uncertain whether to attribute to the light or the cold or the smell or something else, something harder to name that the outside air simply contains by virtue of being outside air, by virtue of being the medium of a world that is still here, still running, that continued throughout your absence with a completeness that is both wonderful and, in this particular moment, slightly brutal. The world has moved on without you. This is the quirky and melancholy historical tidbit embedded in the truth of release. Documented accounts of medieval prisoners returning from extended confinement describe with remarkable consistency a version of the same disorientation, Not just the physical and perceptual readjustment, but the social and temporal one. People they knew had aged, moved, died, married, had children. Political situations that were active when they went in had resolved, sometimes in ways that changed the relevance of the offense they had been imprisoned for. Prices had changed, fashions had changed, the specific texture of daily life had shifted in dozens of small ways that were invisible to people who had lived through the changes and jarring to someone experiencing them as a sudden transition from a fixed point. Some returned prisoners never fully reintegrated. The historical record contains accounts of people released from long confinement who were described by contemporaries as permanently altered, quieter, more withdrawn, prone to a particular kind of stillness that the people around them found difficult to interpret and that we would today recognize as the presentation of what we call post-traumatic stress. Though the medieval world had no clinical framework for it and generally understood it as either a spiritual consequence of the imprisonment experience or simply a change in character that the person had undergone and that was now, for better or worse, who they were. Others reintegrated with a speed and completeness that surprised the observers who documented it, returning to their trades, their families, their social roles, with an apparent resilience that may have been genuine or may have been the surface presentation of a more complex interior adjustment that the documentary record, focused on externally observable behavior, was not equipped to capture. The accounts that survive are almost entirely third-person, what others saw, reported, recorded. The first-person accounts of the interior experience of return are rare enough that each one is a primary historical document of some significance, and they tend, without exception, to describe the return as a second form of disorientation layered over the first, a readjustment that took longer and was stranger than the people around the returning prisoner expected it to be or were prepared to accommodate. You are standing in the courtyard. The person who brought you up is speaking practically about arrangements, where you will go, what provisions have been made, who is waiting and where. You are listening or making the face of listening, while your eyes move around the courtyard with an independent urgency that cannot be directed or slowed, cataloging everything, the stones and the walls and the gate and the people moving in the distance and the sky above it all, the unchanged, enormous, absolutely ordinary sky. Your name was spoken this morning and you came back to it. Not completely, not yet. Some portion of what the dungeon took is going to take considerably longer to return, and some of it, the research and the records and the honest accounting of what sustained confinement does to human beings will confirm, will not return at all in the original form. But enough came back. Enough of you is standing in this courtyard, blinking in the overcast light of a morning in whatever season this is, to make the distinction between enough and all feel, in this particular moment, secondary. The gate is open. Beyond it is a road, and beyond the road is whatever world you are returning to, the world that continued without you, the world that you are going to have to learn again from the beginning in some ways and from the middle in others, the world that contains everything the dungeon did not contain, including the faces of people you love and the smell of food prepared with intention and the extraordinary, taken-for-granted miracle of knowing, at any given moment, what the light outside tells you about the time of day. You take a step toward the gate, then another. The ground is uneven and your legs are still conducting their renegotiation with gravity and your eyes are still processing the scale of everything. But you are walking, which is something you were not certain you would be doing again in open air, on ground that is not stone. Under a sky without a ceiling. The dungeon is behind you. Its inventory, the cold, the dark, the rats, the dripping arithmetic of water, the scratch marks you could not see but felt with your fingertips, the bowls pushed through the slot at intervals that measured out your days in the only units the architecture offered, the warden's torch making the walls warm and brief and then retreating, the names of people who shared the dark and the straw and the thermal mathematics of survival. All of that is behind you, inside the walls, continuing without you now the way the world outside continued without you then. You do not look back. Or you do once because you are human and because the dungeon was the organizing center of your existence for however long it was, and things that have been the organizing center of your existence do not release their claim on your attention simply because you have walked away from them. You look back once at the tower, at the low door set into the base of it, at the absence of any indication in the castle's exterior that what is below it is what is below it. It looks like a building. It looks like a perfectly ordinary piece of medieval architecture, stone and mortar and timber and the patient accumulation of a structure that was built to last and has lasted and will go on lasting long after everyone currently living within it is gone. Then you turn back to the road and to the sky, and to the world that is waiting, imperfect and complicated and full of things that need relearning and relationships that need repairing and a body that needs feeding properly and a mind that needs, more than anything it can currently name, the sustained, ordinary, irreplaceable medicine of time lived in the open air among people who know your name and use it. The gate closes behind you. You walk. And now, traveler, it is time to let all of that go. Let the dungeon dissolve behind you the way it dissolved in the story. Stone by stone, shadow by shadow, until what remains is just the telling of it. The quiet thread of words in the dark of your room, which is not a dungeon. Your room is warm. Your room has a bed, and the bed is yours, and the temperature of the air around you is a temperature that your body has chosen rather than one that was imposed upon it. Notice that. Notice the warmth specifically, the way it sits on your skin and asks nothing of you, the way it simply is, the background kindness of a room that is on your side. Your breathing has slowed while the story wound down. That was not accidental. The pace of the telling has been easing sentence by sentence, the way a hand might ease the tension in a rope that has been pulled taut, gently, gradually, until the tension is gone and what remains is just the rope, soft and still, lying in loose coils. The medieval dungeon is a long way from you tonight. It is also, in the way that all history is close when you let yourself feel it, part of the long human story that you are also part of. The story of people who endured things and came through them, who scratched marks in stone to count the days, who held warmth in their hands and were grateful for it, who heard their names spoken after long silence and returned to themselves, piece by piece, in the open air. You are in the open air in your own way. The night around your house or apartment or wherever you are listening from is full of the ordinary sounds of the world continuing. Distant traffic or wind in trees, or the hum of appliances, or the breathing of other people nearby who are also, in their own way, navigating the long story. Let your body become heavy now. Let your thoughts lose their edges, the way thoughts do when sleep is coming, when the mind is willing to hand over the watch to the deeper parts of the self that do not need language to operate, that know how to carry you through the night without any instruction from the thinking part. The story is over. The dungeon is history. The light outside your door, if there is light, is yours. The dark inside your closed eyes is the comfortable kind. The kind that is yours to move through at your own pace, toward whatever quiet thing is waiting for you on the other side of sleep. Go gently now. The night is soft. The world is old and you are in it, warm and free and drifting, down into the good dark that is nothing like a dungeon and everything like rest. Sweet dreams.